The elevator doors had barely closed before Cassian Rourke's hand connected with the marble wall, hard enough to split the skin across his knuckles. He didn't feel it. What he felt was the image burned into the back of his skull. Elena standing there in that black dress, no coat, no purse, no phone, rain already beginning to streak the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. Standing there like she was waiting for him to take it back, like she actually believed he would. He didn't. He turned away first. And that single moment of turning away would cost him everything he'd spent 15 years building and nearly cost him the one thing he never knew he needed to protect. If you've ever watched someone you love walk out a door because of something you did and felt absolutely certain you were right, stay with this story. Because Cassian Rourke was the most powerful man in Manhattan, and he was catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a like if you're already feeling this one. And I want to know, what city or country are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and it genuinely blows my mind how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the worst night of Cassian Rourke's life. 3 weeks before that elevator closed, Manhattan was already bleeding. Not the kind of bleeding anyone outside Cassian's world would notice. No yellow tape, no news cameras. Nothing that would interrupt the morning commute or rattle the stock market. This was quieter. Shipments vanishing off routes that only 6 men in the entire organization knew about. Cargo gone, drivers found sitting in empty trucks with no memory of the last 4 hours, blinking in parking lots in the Bronx and South Queens like they'd been teleported there. $40 million in merchandise dissolved into the city like it had never existed. The first time it happened, Cassian assumed a systems failure. The second time, he had his logistics chain audited top to bottom and replaced 3 managers he suspected were skimming. The third time, Marcus Webb, his most trusted lieutenant, the man who had been at Cassian's side since they were 19 years old running errands for Cassian's uncle Gideon, came to Cassian's private office on the 41st floor and placed a burner phone on the desk without saying a single word. Cassian looked at the phone. Then he looked at Marcus. Where? Her coat pocket. The gray one she wears to the farmer's market on Saturdays. I wasn't looking for it. Marcus's jaw was tight, the way it got when he had information he genuinely didn't want to deliver. I was pulling a loose button off for her. The pocket was already open. Cassian didn't touch the phone. Has it been accessed? The encryption is military grade. Noah's still working on it. The name Noah Mercer sat in Cassian's chest like a stone. Noah was 26, slight, wore the same gray hoodie 4 days out of 7, and could crack financial systems the FBI had spent 3 years trying to get into. If Noah was still working on it, the phone was serious. Who else knows? No one. Just me. Just you. Cassian picked up the phone. It was light, cheap. The kind of device you bought at a gas station convenience counter for cash and threw away after 2 uses. He turned it over once, then set it back down. Give me the room. Marcus left without argument. He always did. For 22 minutes, Cassian sat in that office and stared at a phone that probably weighed less than 4 ounces. Then he walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the city he controlled. The streets, the corridors, the invisible territories marked not on any map, but in the minds of every family that operated within or around his. A city he had bled for. A city he had built on the singular principle that trust was not freely given. It was proven. It was earned in increments over years, and it could be revoked in a single instant. He had trusted Elena Vasquez, Elena Rourke, as she'd been for 4 years, more than he trusted most of the men he paid to protect him. More than he admitted, even to himself. The thought that she had been feeding information to Adrian Serrano, Adrian, who had spent the better part of a decade trying to dismantle the Rourke network piece by piece, who had poached Cassian's contacts in the Port Authority and bought off 2 of his judges. The thought didn't arrive like a shock. It arrived like a slow collapse. A building that had been quietly cracking at the foundation for months, finally, irrevocably, dropping. He was still standing at the window when the door opened again. He hadn't told Marcus to come back yet, so he knew before he turned around that it wasn't Marcus. Elena stood in the doorway in the dove-gray sweater she wore on evenings she spent reading, the one with the frayed cuff on the left sleeve she kept meaning to repair, and never did. She was holding 2 mugs of coffee. She stopped when she saw his face. What happened? Cassian turned back to the window. Where have you been today? It wasn't a question. His voice had gone somewhere flat and cold. Not loud, never loud, because in his experience, the things that frightened people most were the things delivered quietly. Elena's feet didn't move. He could hear her processing the shift in the room. She was intelligent. That had always been one of the things he stopped that thought before it completed itself. I was at the market this morning, then here all afternoon. Cass, what? Did you stop anywhere? Did you see anyone? I had coffee with Diana at the place on Mercer Street. That was it. A pause. Why are you asking me like that? He turned around. The mugs were still in her hands. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders the way she wore it at home, the way he had, at various points over 4 years, found himself thinking about when he was in rooms he should have been paying better attention to. Her eyes were moving over his face, trying to read him, and he watched her get there. The moment she understood that whatever this was, it was serious. She set the mugs down on the small side table by the door. Cassian, talk to me. The phone, he said. She went very still. That stillness, that was what broke something loose in his chest. An innocent person would have been confused. They would have asked, which phone, what are you talking about? Elena went still like a person who knew exactly what he was referring to and understood in a single heartbeat how it looked. I can explain. Don't. He crossed toward her, not fast, not aggressive. Cassian Rourke had never put a hand on his wife, and he wasn't going to start now. But he crossed the room and stopped 4 feet from her and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, because she had never seen him look at her the way he looked at people he had decided were a threat. Don't explain. Not yet. Not tonight. Cassian, please listen to me. My shipments have been compromised 3 times in 30 days. Routes that only my inner circle knows. Routes that Serrano's people have been waiting at. His voice was still quiet, still even. And now there is a burner phone in your coat. Encrypted. Military-grade encryption. The kind you don't buy because you're having a conversation you want to keep private from me. You buy that kind when the information you're protecting could get people killed. Elena took a breath. Her hands were at her sides, and he could see she was forcing them to stay still. I know how this looks. I need you to trust me and let me explain what that phone actually... Do you know Adrian Serrano? The name dropped into the room like a match into dry wood. Elena didn't answer immediately, and that half second, that fractional delay, was the final piece of a verdict Cassian had already, somewhere underneath all the noise of the last 3 hours, already rendered. Yes, she said, but not the way... How long? Cassian, how long have you been in contact with him? 7 weeks. Listen to me. What I did for you. I need you to... He stopped hearing the words. Not because they weren't reaching him. They were, every one of them. But because he had learned long before Elena that the most dangerous thing you could do in a room with someone who had betrayed you was let their explanations soften your resolve. The explanations always sounded reasonable. That was the point of explanations. Elena was still talking. She was saying something about Gideon, his uncle, his father's brother, the man who had sat at every important table in Cassian's life for as long as he could remember. And her voice was rising now, the careful composure cracking, the urgency bleeding through. Gideon is planning something, Cassian. He's been planning it for months. I found out by accident, and I couldn't come to you directly because you would never believe it was Gideon, not without proof, not without... Stop. She stopped. You contacted my greatest competitor behind my back for 7 weeks. You offered him what exactly? What does Adrian Serrano get in exchange for whatever this arrangement was? Her jaw tightened. Territory. Northern roots. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. You offered Serrano Northern territory. Cassian said it slowly, the way you repeat something when you need to hear it aloud to confirm that you actually heard it correctly. My territory, Rourke territory. You negotiated it away to my enemy, to stop him from helping Gideon kill you. Her voice cracked on the last 2 words, but she didn't look away. There is an ambush planned before dawn, Gideon's men. Cassian, if you walk out of this building tonight without knowing, go downstairs. She stopped. I'm sorry? Go downstairs, Elena. You're done here for tonight. Cassian. Her voice was shaking now, but it was shaking with something other than fear. With the particular fury of someone who is being dismissed in the exact moment they are trying to save the person dismissing them. Listen to what I'm telling you. Your uncle has been... You want me to believe that you spent 7 weeks in secret contact with Adrian Serrano, gave away Northern Territory, arranged meetings I wasn't told about, and you did all of this because you were trying to protect me. From Gideon. He looked at her for a long moment. Gideon, who raised me. Gideon, who sat at my father's funeral and held my mother's hand. Gideon, who has been the most loyal person in this room right now is me. Her voice broke on the last word. She caught it, pulled it back. And you are making the worst mistake of your life. He walked to the front entrance and pressed the elevator call button. The doors opened immediately. If Serrano matters so much, Cassian said, and his voice was completely level, completely controlled, which would later be the thing he remembered most clearly and with the most shame, how controlled he had sounded. Let him protect you. Elena stood in the middle of the foyer and looked at him. She looked at him the way people look at something they're trying to memorize because some part of them understands they might not see it again. Then she walked into the elevator. The doors closed. Cassian went back to his office, sat down in the chair behind his desk, and did not move for 40 minutes. The city glittered below him. Somewhere down in those streets, his wife was walking in a cocktail dress and heels, with no phone, no money, no coat, in a city where the temperature was dropping below freezing, and where at least some of the people who might recognize her were people he had, over the years, made into enemies. He told himself he would give her 2 hours. She would call from a payphone or borrow a phone from a restaurant, and when she called, he would send Marcus to get her, and they would have the conversation. He should have had an hour ago, calmly, with the phone decrypted and everything visible. He told himself that. He sat in his chair and watched the rain begin on the other side of the glass, silver sheets of it catching the light from the streets below. And he told himself Elena was resourceful, Elena was intelligent, Elena had grown up in this city before she ever knew his name, and she would be fine. He told himself that for exactly 40 minutes. Then his phone rang. Not Elena's number. Elena didn't have her phone. This was Marcus calling from the building entrance downstairs, and when Cassian answered, Marcus's voice had the particular quality it carried when he had been running. Boss, 3 black SUVs just ran the camera on West 57th heading toward the park. Plates are burned. Cassian was already standing. Whose? One of them belongs to a holding company connected to Serrano's Brooklyn operation. The air went out of the room. Find my wife, Cassian said. Find her right now. He was already reaching for his coat. Outside the window, Manhattan swallowed the rain without slowing down. Somewhere in those streets, those dark, freezing, indifferent streets, Elena was walking alone in a city that her husband controlled, and her husband had just, in the space of an elevator ride, removed her from every protection that control provided. And Cassian Rourke, feared by every organization between the Hudson and the East River, ran for the elevator with his knuckles still bleeding from where he'd split them against the wall. Cassian hit the lobby at a dead run and almost took Marcus off his feet. Marcus caught his arm, steadied him, and fell into step without being told. That was the thing about Marcus Webb. 23 years at Cassian's side had eliminated the need for most words between them. A look was a sentence. A silence was a paragraph. And the look on Cassian's face right now was an entire chapter Marcus was already reading and did not like. Talk, Cassian said. They were moving through the building's service exit, the one that fed into the parking structure on 56th, away from the front entrance and whatever eyes might be watching it. 2 of Cassian's security detail fell in behind them without being summoned, which meant Marcus had already called it in. She left on foot, heading west. Building cameras picked her up at the corner, then lost her when she turned toward the park. No cab, no rideshare. Her phone is upstairs. Her cards are upstairs. Marcus kept his voice low and clipped, the way he delivered information he knew was going to land badly. It's 31 degrees out there, boss. Wind chill is worse. Cassian didn't respond to that. He couldn't. The SUVs? 2 of the 3 we tracked on 57th have gone dark. No camera hits after Columbus Circle. The 3rd one did a slow pass on Central Park West about 11 minutes ago and turned south. Serrano's holding company. Confirmed. The plate traces to a logistics shell he uses for midtown operations. It's not a coincidence. They reached the parking structure. Cashin's car, the black G-Wagon, not the armored Escalade he used for formal movement, the one he drove himself when he needed to think, was already running. Marcus had called ahead. Cassian got in. Marcus got in the passenger seat, which was unusual enough that neither of them acknowledged it. Cassian pulled out without a word and headed west. The rain was worse than it had looked from 41 floors up. It came in at an angle, driven by the wind off the Hudson, the kind of rain that found the gap between your collar and your neck and made itself at home. The streets were mostly empty at this hour. After midnight now, the restaurants clearing out, the last of the theater crowd already in cabs. A few dog walkers. A delivery guy on an e-bike, head down, pushing into the weather. No Elena. Cashin drove the block between the building and the park entrance twice, then cut south along Central Park West, eyes moving to every doorway, every awning, every cluster of people sheltering from the rain under scaffolding. Marcus had his phone out, pulling feeds from the street camera network they'd spent 3 years quietly integrating into their intelligence operation. Anything, Cashin said. It wasn't really a question. Working on it. A pause. Then, Noah's got something. Camera on West 61st picked up a woman matching her description 15 minutes ago, heading south on the park side. She was moving fast. Cassian turned hard onto 61st. Is she okay? Marcus was quiet for a second too long. She was moving, he said, which was not the same thing as okay, and they both knew it. Cassian pushed the G-Wagon harder than the wet streets could reasonably handle, and Marcus grabbed the door handle with the quiet dignity of a man who had made peace with his own mortality several years ago but still preferred to arrive at it naturally. They were 4 blocks south when Marcus's phone rang. Marcus looked at the screen. His expression did something complicated. It's Noah. Speaker. Noah Mercer's voice came through thin and slightly breathless, the way it always did when he'd been running multiple systems simultaneously, and something unexpected had happened in all of them at once. Okay, so I've got the phone. The G-Wagon's interior went very still. The encryption, Cassian said. You're in. Yeah, about 40 minutes ago. I've been going through it and A pause. The kind of pause that had weight to it. Boss, I need you to tell me what you want me to do with what I'm looking at, because this isn't what we thought. Cassian's hands tightened on the wheel. Tell me. The messages are to Serrano. That part's accurate. But they're not. She's not giving him anything. She's not passing routes or schedules or anything operational. Noah's voice was careful, picking its way through the information like a man walking across ice he wasn't sure would hold. She's been negotiating with him. 7 weeks of back and forth. She offered him the Northern Territory corridor in exchange for... He stopped. Noah. In exchange for him blocking a hit, a coordinated ambush. She sent him an outline of the plan she'd found, time and location, and she asked him to... Another pause. Shorter this time. She asked him to intervene, to stop it. The last message she sent him was 3 days ago, and it just said, please save my husband. The rain hit the windshield. Cassian didn't speak. Marcus was looking at his hands. The hit, Cassian said, and his voice had gone somewhere he'd never heard it go before. Somewhere quiet and airless, like the room had been vacuumed out. Who ordered it? That's the other thing. Noah exhaled. The plan she intercepted, the logistics, the safe house confirmations, the communication chain, it traces back to an internal account, an old one, set up years ago under a shell that roots through 3 layers, but the final origin point is, say the name. The origin point is Gideon Rourke. The G-Wagon's wheels hit a pothole and Cassian barely registered it. He was driving on something that wasn't conscious thought anymore. His hands knew what to do with the steering wheel. The rest of him was somewhere else entirely, processing a reconfiguration so total and so rapid that his body was still running the old map while his mind was trying to burn it. Gideon, his uncle, his father's only brother, the man who had driven him to his first day of school because his father was already in a federal holding facility by then, and his mother couldn't stop crying long enough to find the car keys. The man who had taught him how to read a room, how to walk into a negotiation without broadcasting anything, how to give orders that people would follow, not just out of fear, but out of a specific quality of respect that had to be cultivated over years. The man who had, 7 weeks ago, apparently decided that the empire he had helped build was better off under his own name. She knew, Cassian said. She figured it out about 2 months back based on the message trail. She didn't. She wrote to Serrano that she couldn't go to you directly because she knew you wouldn't believe it without proof, and she didn't have proof yet, just fragments. She said, Noah's voice got quieter. She said she knew how much Gideon meant to you and that accusing him without evidence would only make you turn on her instead. Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Cassian said nothing. She had been right. He had turned on her anyway, without evidence, without giving her 60 seconds to explain, on the basis of a phone that hadn't even been decrypted yet. And he had sent her out into a freezing city where Gideon's people now knew she had been working to expose them. The realization arrived not as an emotion, but as a physical thing, a pressure behind his sternum, like someone had placed a hand flat against his chest and was pushing. The SUVs, he said. Marcus was already ahead of him. If Gideon knows she discovered the plan, he knows. He would have had ears on anything connected to Serrano. The moment she made contact 7 weeks ago, he would have started tracking her. Cassian's jaw was so tight, his back teeth ached. He didn't move against her while she was in the building because he needed her accessible, needed to know what she'd found and who she'd told. But the moment she walked out the door alone with no protection, he stopped talking and pressed the accelerator. Marcus was already on another call, deploying the other 2 vehicles they had in the field tonight, redirecting them south along the park. On the scanner running through Noah's feed, 3 camera hits in the last 8 minutes were painting a trail. A woman moving south and east through the rainy dark, and somewhere behind her, black vehicles moving without headlights. Cassian ran 2 red lights. He didn't care. Boss, Marcus's voice warning him. There's a report coming in through the police scanner. Shots fired near the Brooklyn Bridge on-ramp. Multiple vehicles. Cassian's blood went cold. Brooklyn Bridge. It's a waterfront location. If they were moving her, he was already turning, cutting across 3 lanes of empty midnight asphalt, the G-Wagon's tires screaming against the wet pavement. Marcus braced himself against the dashboard and kept talking into his phone, voice steady, feeding coordinates to the other vehicles, running the kind of parallel logistics that Cassian had always depended on him for and had never, until this moment, truly considered what it cost a man to be that reliable under that kind of pressure. The drive to the Manhattan Bridge underpass took 11 minutes. It felt like 11 hours. When Cassian pulled up, the scene was the kind of controlled chaos that told a story before anyone spoke a word. 2 cars that were not his. One with its rear quarter panel caved in against a concrete support pillar, one with its front end buried in a chain-link fence. And Adrian Serrano's men, 4 of them, one sitting against the barrier holding his arm, one standing with a phone pressed to his ear, 2 crouched behind the damaged vehicle. And behind the second car, behind Adrian Serrano's crumpled, rain-soaked, shot-through vehicle, on the cold, wet ground of the Manhattan Bridge underpass, was Elena. Cassian was out of the G-Wagon before it had fully stopped moving. Marcus shouted something at him, a warning, a name, something, and Cassian wasn't listening to any of it because he was crossing 30 feet of wet concrete at a run and the world had narrowed to a single point of focus. She was on her side, not moving. Someone's coat was draped over her, an expensive one, charcoal wool, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And it was soaked through from the rain and from something darker spreading from beneath her left shoulder. Cassian dropped to his knees beside her. The ground was wet and freezing, and he didn't feel it. Elena. Her face was wrong. Too pale, the color of old paper, with a deep cut above her left temple that had bled down the side of her face and dried in the cold into something that looked like rust. But she was breathing. He could see it, the shallow rise and fall of her ribcage under the weight of that coat. And when he put his hand on the side of her face, her skin was cold, but not the specific cold of someone whose body had stopped trying. Elena, look at me. Her eyelids moved, heavy, like they weighed too much. Then they opened, not all the way, just enough. She looked at him. And the first thing she did, the very first thing, before she tried to speak, before she moved, before she did anything a person lying bleeding on wet concrete in the middle of a gunfight aftermath would reasonably do, was try to reach for his arm to check whether he was hurt. Her hand made it about 4 inches before her strength gave out. Did they get you?" she whispered. Her voice was almost nothing, The volume of someone talking in a library, but he heard every word because he was 6 inches from her face and the rest of the world had gone completely quiet. No. His voice didn't sound like his voice. I'm here. I'm right here. Gideon, I know. Noah got into the phone. I know everything. Her eyes closed again. Not unconscious, he could see the tension in her face, the effort of processing. Then, you believed me. He didn't answer that because the honest answer was that he had believed Noah's data before he had believed her, and Elena deserved better than a comforting lie delivered over a gunshot wound. You're going to be okay, he said instead. We have a medical facility. Adrian. She was trying to move her head, trying to look around. Is he... He was in the car when they... Don't move your head. Is he alive, Cassian? He looked up. One of Serrano's men was on his feet now, the one with the phone, and he was watching Cassian with the specific, careful expression of someone who had prepared to die tonight and was still recalibrating to the fact that he hadn't. He gave a short nod. Your man is alive, Cassian said. He's mobile. Elena's body released something. A held breath, a held tension, some structural thing she'd been gripping for however long she'd been lying on this ground. She let it go all at once and sagged against the wet concrete, and Cassian had his arms under her before she finished the movement, pulling her up off the ground with the coat and all, gathering her against his chest. She was lighter than he remembered, or maybe he'd never held her like this before, not pulled, not rescued, not with her bleeding and shaking and completely spent. He'd held her 1,000 times in their 4 years, but never like she might break if he did it wrong. I've got you, he said, which was meaningless as statements went, because it was also what he'd been telling himself their entire marriage, while simultaneously, apparently, not quite believing it. Marcus was at his elbow with logistics already deployed. The clinic on the west side, the surgical team who worked for Cassian's organization and asked no questions that couldn't be answered with a number. 2 vehicles pulling in behind the G-Wagon right now. A controlled, efficient extraction. But before Cassian stood up with Elena in his arms, he looked across the underpass to where Adrian Serrano had emerged from behind his wrecked vehicle, moving carefully, one hand pressed to his side where he was evidently not entirely undamaged, but was upright and functioning under his own power. Adrian Serrano was 41, lean, with the kind of face that had been described in federal intelligence reports as unremarkable 3 separate times, which was one of the primary reasons he was still operating at the level he was. He was soaked through, his suit destroyed, and there was a cut across his cheekbone that was going to need stitching before the night was over. He looked at Cassian holding Elena. He looked at the coat she was wrapped in. His coat. He didn't say anything. Cassian met his eyes across 30 feet of cold concrete, and he didn't say anything either, because there wasn't a sentence in any language he spoke that would have covered the appropriate ground. And Cassian Rourke was not a man who offered words he couldn't fully stand behind. But he held the eye contact for a long moment, and he nodded once. Adrian nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't alliance. It was something smaller and more complicated. An acknowledgement, man to man, across the wreckage of a fight that neither of them had started, but both of them were going to have to live inside the consequences of. Then Cassian stood, lifted Elena carefully, and carried her to the car. She was unconscious before he got the door open. The drive to the clinic took 9 minutes. Marcus sat in the back with Cassian, holding a compress from the emergency kit against Elena's shoulder wound, talking in short, quiet sentences to the medical team, already prepping for their arrival. Cassian sat beside her with her head against his shoulder and his hand flat against her cold cheek, and he did not say anything to Marcus, and Marcus did not ask him to. He had done this. That was the accounting he was running in the back of his mind beneath all the immediate logistics of keeping his wife alive. This specific night, these specific consequences were a direct result of a choice he had made at a hotel elevator at 11:42 p.m., with Elena's voice still in his ears telling him that Gideon was planning something catastrophic. She had asked him to trust her. He had looked at her and decided she wasn't worth the risk. The clinic's underground entrance opened ahead of them, and Marcus's hand moved on Cassian's shoulder. Quick, once, the way you touch a person to bring them back from somewhere far away. The medical team was waiting. Cassian got out of the car, and he was reaching for Elena when one of the surgeons, Dr. Harlan Fitch, 50s, who had been patching up Cassian's people since before Cassian was old enough to take over the organization, put a hand on Cassian's arm and looked at the wound and looked at Elena's color and said, without preamble, the way he always communicated, because he had learned over 2 decades that Cassian responded to facts, not cushioning. The shoulder wound has caused secondary internal bleeding. She needs the table now. You need to let go. Cassian looked at his wife's unconscious face. She'll be okay, he said, and it was not quite a question and not quite a statement. Not if we spend another 30 seconds at this door, Harlan said. Cassian let go. The team moved Elena inside and the doors swung shut between them, and Cassian stood in the underground corridor with his hands open at his sides, and the cold from his wet clothes settling into his skin. And he understood in that moment with the specific clarity that only arrives after catastrophic decisions have already completed their damage, that of all the enemies he had neutralized, all the threats he had anticipated and dismantled, all the sophisticated and dangerous people who had tried to come at him over 15 years of running a criminal empire, the most destructive thing that had ever been let inside his walls was his own certainty. He had been certain Elena was guilty. He had been wrong, and his certainty had put her on the ground of a rainy underpass in a coat that belonged to his greatest rival, while her blood soaked through into the concrete. Marcus appeared beside him with a paper cup of coffee from somewhere. Marcus always found coffee, it was one of his more inexplicable skills, and held it out without a word. Cassian took it. He didn't drink it, he just held it. Gideon, he said after a while. I've got eyes on the estate, he's there. He doesn't know yet that tonight didn't go the way it was supposed to. He will by morning. Yes. Cassian stared at the closed doors. And the hit. The original plan. Before dawn, she said. We're pulling Gideon's operational network right now based on what Noah extracted from the phone. His people are scattered across 4 staging locations in Queens and the Bronx. The moment he gets word that tonight failed, he'll move the timeline up or he'll run. Cassian drank some of the coffee. It was terrible. Gas station quality, burnt at the bottom, the kind of coffee Marcus had been getting him from whatever was closest for 23 years, because Marcus understood that Cassian needed something in his hands when he was thinking. Have you told anyone else what we found? About Gideon? No, just you and Noah. Keep it that way until I say otherwise. He was quiet for a moment. How many of our people have been with Gideon since before my father died? Marcus thought about it. 8, maybe 10 in the senior tier. Could be more in operations. Your uncle has had 30 years to build relationships that you don't have full visibility on. Meaning, if I move too fast and it looks like an internal power grab, meaning some of those people will choose blood over logic, and you could have a split. Marcus's voice was even, which is probably what Gideon calculated. He knew you'd have to either move decisively enough to be accused of paranoia or carefully enough to give him time to execute. He designed it so there was no clean play. He's known you your whole life, boss. He designed it knowing exactly how you operate. The corridor hummed with the quiet noise of the building's ventilation system. Somewhere on the other side of those doors, Harlan and his team were working on Elena, and Cassian was standing in a hallway doing the math on a betrayal that had been constructed with the specific expertise of someone who had spent 30 years watching him learn. His uncle. The word had always felt like something structural, a load-bearing piece of the architecture of who Cassian was and how he understood the world. Gideon had been present at every significant moment. He had been the voice in Cassian's ear when the voice in his ear was the most important voice he had. He had shaped Cassian's understanding of loyalty, of family, of what it meant to hold power responsibly. And all of it, apparently, had been instruction delivered by a man who was building his own argument for taking what he was helping create. He's going to run, Cassian said. The moment he knows Elena is alive and in our custody, he knows Noah will have the phone data. He'll move everything he has left and he'll disappear before I can... His own phone rang. He looked at the screen. The number was not in his contacts. It was a New York area code, the prefix used by a range of midtown businesses, and he would normally have let it go to a dedicated voicemail operated by Marcus's team. He answered it. Mr. Rourke. The voice was unhurried, slightly accented in a way that had been significantly softened by what sounded like a long time in American cities. I understand the evening has been complicated. I thought you might want to speak before you make decisions about what comes next. Cassian's grip on the phone tightened almost imperceptibly. Adrian Serrano. How did you get this number? Cassian said. Your wife gave it to me 7 weeks ago. She said if anything went wrong, I should call it. A pause. Something went wrong. Marcus was watching Cassian's face and reading it the way he always did, adjusting his posture, moving slightly closer. "Where are you?" Cassian said. "Midtown, getting stitched up, which I gather your wife is also doing at the moment, so we have a few minutes." Another pause, and when Serrano spoke again, the unhurried quality had a different texture to it, something more considered. "I want to discuss Gideon Rourke. Specifically, I want to discuss the fact that he also contacted me approximately 10 days before your wife did, with a very different kind of offer." The hallway felt smaller. "He offered me your territory," Serrano said. "All of it. The full Rourke operation, as a transfer of control once you were no longer in a position to contest it. He framed it as an opportunity for consolidation. He was very persuasive." A brief silence. "I declined." "Why?" Cassian said. It was the only relevant question. "Because his offer required me to do nothing while he killed you, and I don't make agreements that require me to swallow a man's death alongside the paperwork." Serrano's voice was almost conversational. "Also, your wife contacted me 9 days later, and whatever she offered was considerably more honest about what it was and what she was asking for in return." Cassian sat down on the metal bench along the corridor wall. He wasn't aware of deciding to sit. His legs simply arrived at the decision independently. "She asked you to stop the ambush. She asked me to make it impossible for Gideon to execute it by pulling the street-level cooperation he'd been counting on from 2 crews that operate in spaces where my network overlaps with his. It was not a complicated operation." A pause. "What was complicated was that your people then followed my vehicle for 4 hours tonight because someone in your organization flagged my plates and didn't communicate that information to the right people in time to prevent an engagement." "Gideon's people flagged your plates," Cassian said, "and fed the information to my security team as if it were standard surveillance. They wanted your vehicle intercepted. They wanted Elena in that vehicle when it happened." The silence from Serrano's end had a particular quality to it. "I had wondered," he said. "He needed her off the board before I could talk to her. If she died in a confrontation between my people and yours, that ends you and me in the same stroke." Cassian's voice was flat. "Classic Gideon. 2 birds." "Elegant," Serrano said, without admiration. "He's going to run." "Yes. He has a private landing strip in New Jersey he's been maintaining through a holding company for the last 3 years. I know about it because he offered me access to it during our initial conversation as a demonstration of good faith." Another pause. "I can have that location to you in the next 4 minutes if you want it." Cassian looked at the closed doors across the corridor. Behind those doors, Elena was on a table because Cassian had chosen his certainty over her voice. He had believed in blood, and Gideon had spent 30 years making himself look like the most trustworthy blood in the room. "Send it," Cassian said. "Done." A brief pause. "Mr. Rourke, one more thing." "Say it." "Your wife she's an unusual person, the kind that's harder to find than most people realize until after they've already lost them." Serrano's voice was careful, not cruel, not warm, just careful. "Whatever happened tonight that put her on that street without a coat, I don't have visibility on your marriage, and I'm not asking for any. But she spent 7 weeks trying to save a man who, by her own account in those messages, wasn't going to believe her when she told him the truth." Cassian didn't respond. "That's not a character flaw," Serrano said. "That's a specific kind of devotion, the kind it would be worth not wasting." The call ended. Cassian held the phone in both hands and looked at it for a moment, then set it down on the bench beside him and put his face in his hands and stayed there. Marcus didn't say anything. He sat down on the other end of the bench, and he was quiet, which was what Cassian needed, and Marcus always seemed to know what Cassian needed, even when Cassian didn't. 4 minutes later, Noah's voice came through on Marcus's phone with the location of Gideon's private airstrip and the name of the shell company maintaining it and the flight plan that had been filed 40 minutes ago for a departure at 4:30 a.m. It was currently 2:17 a.m. Cassian raised his head. His eyes were dry. His expression was the one Marcus had seen exactly 3 times before in 23 years. Not rage, not grief, something that sat underneath both of those and was older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. "I need 6 people," Cassian said. "People whose loyalty doesn't trace back to my uncle. People I can verify personally." "I have them," Marcus said. "And I need Noah running Gideon's communication channels, so that if he tries to warn anyone or move up his timeline, we know the second he touches the device. Already running, Cassian stood up. He looked at the doors across the corridor one more time. Elena was behind them, being kept alive by a team that operated in the gray spaces of the city Cassian controlled. And he could not be with her right now, and he could not go after Gideon and stay with her simultaneously, and every option available to him tonight required him to leave someone or something that mattered. He had already made the wrong choice once tonight about what to protect and what to let walk out the door. He was not going to make it again. "Marcus," he said. "Yeah. If anything changes while I'm gone, if Harlan comes out of those doors with news, I'll call you before he finishes the first sentence." Cassian buttoned his coat. Somewhere across the city, in a house full of 30 years of carefully maintained deception, Gideon Rourke was packing a bag and calculating how much time he had left. He had 2 hours and 13 minutes. He didn't know that yet. The drive to New Jersey took 41 minutes. Cassian drove himself again, the same G-Wagon, because Marcus had taken the second vehicle with 3 of the 6 men and was coming in from the south approach, while Cassian came in from the east. They had mapped it on a gas station receipt using a borrowed pen, old school, nothing digital, because Noah had confirmed that Gideon's communication network included at least 2 people inside Cassian's own tech infrastructure whose access hadn't been fully audited yet. That piece of information, 2 people inside the tech layer, people who had been sitting inside Cassian's intelligence operation potentially for years, had arrived via a text from Noah at 2:34 a.m. and had the quality of a stone dropping into still water. Quiet impact. Expanding consequences. Cassian had read it at a red light on the turnpike and then put his phone face down on the passenger seat and driven the rest of the way in silence. The airstrip was private, the kind that existed in the county records as an agricultural equipment facility and in reality as a paved strip behind a salvage yard owned by a holding company, connected to a holding company connected to a real estate trust that traced back to Gideon Rourke through 6 layers of corporate paper. Serrano's information was exact. Gate codes, building layout, the position of the single security camera covering the main hangar entrance. Either Gideon had trusted Serrano with a remarkable amount of operational detail during their initial negotiation, or Serrano had done his own homework after the fact. Cassian suspected both. He pulled off the main road 2 miles from the facility and killed the headlights, moving the rest of the way on parking lights along the service road that ran parallel to the fence line. The 3 men in the vehicle behind him, Doyle, who had been with Cassian for 11 years and whose loyalty Cassian had verified personally by cross-checking his financials against Gideon's known payment patterns. Reyes, who had no connection to Gideon's network because he'd been recruited out of a Miami operation 3 years ago. And Carr, 28 years old, former military, who had been hired 8 months ago and therefore predated none of Gideon's deeper machinations, followed without headlights at a 50-yard interval. At 2:51 a.m., they stopped at the fence line. The facility was quiet. 1 light burning in the main hangar structure. 1 vehicle, a dark blue sedan, parked at the side entrance. The small aircraft visible through the hangar's open side door was a twin-engine Cessna, the kind of plane you used when you needed to move without filing a meaningful flight plan, and someone had already run it out onto the near edge of the tarmac. Cassian looked at it through the fence for a moment. Gideon was already prepped for departure, which meant he had gotten word. Not full word. If he'd known the airstrip location had been compromised, the plane would already be in the air. But something had reached him. Something had broken the timeline. Cassian's phone vibrated. Noah. He just accessed his secondary comms. Someone called him from a blocked number 6 minutes ago. 30-second conversation. I couldn't intercept it in time. He knows something. Cassian texted back a single word. How long? Noah. He moves now. Plane's in the air in 12 minutes. It's a short runway. He doesn't need a crew. Cassian put the phone away. He looked at Doyle, who was crouched at the fence post reading the same situation through a different set of eyes. 2 on the inside, minimum, Doyle said quietly. The sedan means a driver waiting. Whoever called him is probably already inside. Gideon doesn't fly himself, Cassian said. There's a pilot. That's 3. 3 is fine, He looked at the gate, which was padlocked with the code Serrano had provided. He looked at the camera, which was positioned to cover the main entrance and had a blind spot along the south fence line of approximately 12 feet, which Serrano had also noted with the specific attention to detail of a man who had personally walked the property. South line, Cassian said. Cut the fence, go in low. I want Gideon breathing when we reach him. Doyle nodded and moved. They were through the fence in 4 minutes and across the open ground between the fence and the hangar's south wall in another 2, moving in the specific compressed silence that comes not from training alone, but from the animal understanding of what happens if you make noise in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Cassian went in first. The hangar smelled like aviation fuel and cold concrete and the particular closed air quality of a building that was used infrequently and aired out rarely. The twin-engine plane sat on the tarmac just outside, running lights dark, and from inside the hangar Cassian could hear voices. 2 of them, one older, one younger, both tense. He moved along the south wall to the interior door. He could see them now. Gideon Rourke was 64 years old, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had once been physically imposing and had softened into something that still carried the shape of authority, even if the substance had relocated primarily to his jawline and his posture. He was wearing a dark overcoat, and he had a single leather bag at his feet, the kind of bag a man packs when he's planned an exit for long enough that he's winnowed his essentials down to what actually fits. Beside him was a man Cassian didn't immediately recognize, young, maybe 30, in the functional clothing of someone who worked in a support role. And they were having an argument in low, rapid voices about whether to wait for confirmation of something or move immediately. The pilot, presumably, was already at the aircraft. Cassian stepped into the light. Gideon saw him. The argument stopped the way sound stops when you cut a wire. Instantly, completely, with a residual vibration in the air where it had been. Gideon's face went through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. The first was surprise, which he couldn't help. The second was a rapid recalibration, the expression of a man who has been planning contingencies long enough that surprise is just the trigger for the next prepared response. The third was something that Cassian spent the rest of his life trying to accurately describe to himself and never quite managed. Something that might have been regret, or might have been the face of a man who had always known this specific moment was a possible outcome and had decided the gamble was worth it anyway. The young man beside Gideon moved his hand toward his jacket. Doyle put a gun against the back of his skull before the hand completed the motion. "Don't," Doyle said pleasantly. The young man's hand stopped. Cassian walked across the hangar floor until he was standing 8 feet from his uncle, and he stopped there and looked at him for a long moment with his hands at his sides. Gideon straightened his coat. "You're faster than I expected," Gideon said. His voice was even. Not calm exactly. There was a quality of controlled effort behind the evenness, but even. The airstrip was supposed to be clean. Serrano gave it to me. Gideon absorbed that with a slow nod, the nod of a man updating a mental map. He declined my offer. He mentioned, and partnered with Elena instead. Gideon said his sister-in-law's name the way you say the name of a long-standing complication. Not with heat, not with contempt, just with the tired acknowledgement of something that had consistently refused to cooperate. She's more resourceful than I gave her credit for. I did give her credit, incidentally. That's not false modesty. I underestimated the depth of her commitment. "She's in surgery," Cassian said. "Your people put a bullet in her shoulder. My people put a bullet in Serrano's vehicle during an authorized engagement of what they understood to be a hostile convoy." Gideon's voice was precise. Elena's presence in that vehicle was a complication I had not intended. "You intended her dead. Don't dress it up." "I intended her removed from the situation before she could reach you with information that was going to—" Gideon stopped. He looked at Cassian with the expression of a man deciding how much honesty serves him at this point, and then apparently deciding that full honesty costs nothing he hasn't already spent. "Yes, I intended her dead. She found the plan. She moved against it. In my position, what would you have done?" Cassian said nothing. "You would have done exactly what I did," Gideon said. "You would have identified the threat and removed it. That's what I taught you." "You taught me a lot of things," Cassian said. "I'm starting to understand which ones were actually for my benefit." Gideon's mouth tightened. Not much. Gideon had always had exceptional control over his face, but enough. "Sit down," Cassian said. "I'd rather—" "Sit down, Gideon." The older man looked at him for a moment, then picked up his leather bag and moved to the metal chair against the hangar wall and sat down, the bag between his feet, his hands resting on his knees. The posture of a man who was calculating whether the conversation could still provide a usable exit. Cassian pulled a second chair and sat across from him. Close enough to talk. Far enough that this wasn't a performance of intimacy that neither of them was going to mean. The shipments, Cassian said. Leverage, Gideon said. I needed Serrano looking at you, not at me. Every route that leaked, every cargo that disappeared, it went through him. It made you look compromised to your own people, and it built his operational debt to me without him understanding the full picture. How long have you been building the case for taking over? Gideon considered the question the way he considered most questions. Briefly, from multiple angles, with the efficiency of a man who had been a strategic thinker so long that the process happened below conscious effort. Seriously? 18 months, in the back of my mind? He paused. Since your father died. The hangar was very quiet. Your father, Gideon said, and his voice shifted into something that was neither warm nor cold, but had a genuine texture of old grief worn smooth by repeated handling, was the better man. He should have led this family for another 30 years. He would have. And when he was gone, he stopped. You were 26. You didn't know what you were doing. I spent 8 years teaching you, shaping you, handing you the tools and the relationships and the institutional knowledge that made the Rourke operation what it is. And then I watched you run it as if it had simply arrived fully formed, as if the architecture of it had materialized from your own capability and not from 3 decades of my investment. So this is about credit, Cassian said. This is about succession, Gideon said sharply, the first real heat entering his voice. Your father's empire should have passed to your father's brother. That's how it worked before your father decided. He stopped again, pulled the heat back. Blood succession was always the Rourke principle. Your father changed it. He named you over me. He was wrong. I spent 18 months working toward a correction. By killing me. By removing you from a position you occupied because of sentiment rather than merit and restoring the proper order. Cassian looked at his uncle and felt something that was not quite rage and not quite sorrow, but lived in the neighborhood of both. A specific exhausted recognition, the kind that arrives when a thing you thought was solid turns out to have been hollow for a long time, and you just weren't testing it. Elena told me you were planning something, Cassian said. She came to me directly, and I didn't believe her. Gideon nodded, without satisfaction. No, you wouldn't have. That was part of the design. Not the Elena element specifically. I hadn't anticipated she would move so independently. But the broader architecture. I have been the most consistent presence in your life for 38 years. Dislodging that trust would require more than accusations. It would require evidence that you were temperamentally willing to accept, delivered by a source you had reason to credit. He looked at Cassian steadily. I knew you'd defend me against anything she said without proof. I knew it because I taught you exactly that principle. Trust blood. Trust blood, Cassian repeated. It served you for 15 years. It served you for 15 years? Gideon's jaw tightened again. Tell me about the 2 people in my tech infrastructure, Cassian said. Something moved across Gideon's face. Brief, rapidly suppressed. You know about those. Noah is thorough. Those are long-term placements. They go back further than 18 months. Gideon said it without embarrassment, which was somehow the most disturbing part of the sentence. I've maintained contingency visibility inside your operation for 11 years. Access points I established while I was still running our shared infrastructure before you fully separated the networks. It was... He paused. Insurance. I had no immediate plans to use it. It was simply prudent to maintain access in case the relationship deteriorated. 11 years. The number arrived like something blunt connecting with the back of Cassian's skull. 11 years. Before Elena. Before the 3 operations that had defined the last decade's expansion. Before everything that Cassian had considered the architecture of his independent empire. Gideon had been inside it the entire time. Who else? Cassian said. What? Who else inside my organization? Not just the tech layer, all of it. I want every name. Gideon looked at him with the expression of a man calculating the value of what he holds against the cost of the situation he's in. I'm not going to... Gideon. Cassian's voice was very quiet. I am trying very hard right now to honor the 38 years you just cited. I am trying very hard to sit in this chair and talk to you like you are a person who deserves that. But my wife is bleeding in a clinic across the river because of decisions you made. And I have been awake for 22 hours. and my patience for what you will and will not do is running on a very short supply line." Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small USB drive and held it out. Cassian looked at it. He didn't take it immediately. "Everything," Gideon said. "Names, access points, communication logs. The 2 in the tech layer, plus 4 others in operations and 1 in your legal network. It's all there." He paused. "I kept meticulous records. It was always going to end one way or another, and I preferred to have the documentation." Cassian took the drive. He held it in his palm and looked at it, and he thought about the specific texture of betrayal, how it was never sharp the way you imagined it would be, never clean, never arrived in a form you could simply react to and move past. It was accumulated. It was architectural. It was a thing built into the walls of your house by someone who understood the blueprint. "Marcus," he said. Marcus stepped forward from the south wall where he'd been standing since they'd cleared the hangar. "Take him." Gideon stood. He picked up his leather bag out of instinct, then looked at it for a moment and set it back down, which was somehow the most human thing that had happened in the entire conversation. "Cassian." His voice, for the first time tonight, had lost the quality of calculation. "I did love your father." "I know you did," Cassian said. "I think that's what made the rest of it possible." Marcus took Gideon's arm, not rough, not gentle, just functional, and walked him toward the south door. Doyle followed with the young man whose hand had moved too fast and stopped faster. Reyes went to deal with the pilot. Cassian stood alone in the hangar for about 90 seconds. He turned the USB drive over in his palm twice, then pocketed it. Then he took out his phone and called Noah. "Talk to me about the tech layer," he said. "Not later, now. I need to know what those access points can see." Noah's voice on the other end was 3 seconds arriving, which for Noah was the equivalent of anyone else's stunned silence. "Everything," Noah said. "I mean, everything, boss. Communications, financial tracking, movement logs, the security camera feeds from the building, and the 4 facilities. If they've had access for 11 years and they were pulling data on any regular basis, what's the exposure? I need time to audit what was accessed versus what was available. Realistically? Days, not hours. But if they were strategic about it, and based on what I've seen of how Gideon built this thing, they were strategic. They would have been pulling specifically the intelligence that gave him leverage. Not everything, the useful things. What would be most useful?" A pause. "The financial structure, the legal network, and..." Noah hesitated. "Say it." "Your personal calendar, your movement patterns. If they had your movement data for 11 years, they know every location you use, every routine, every variation in your schedule. They'd know where you are on any given night with better accuracy than most of your own people." Cassian stood very still. "Noah, my home. The penthouse. The residential security system." A longer pause this time, the kind with real weight. "I'm pulling the access logs right now," Noah said, and his voice had changed into the specific flat register he used when he was looking at something that alarmed him and was choosing to process it before he articulated it. "How long?" Cassian said. "Give me 4 minutes." Cassian walked out of the hangar onto the tarmac. The twin-engine Cessna sat 15 feet away, running lights still dark, going nowhere. The sky to the east had the very first gray intimation of something that would eventually be dawn, still 2 hours away but beginning to suggest itself along the horizon. His phone buzzed. Not Noah. A different number. The clinic. Dr. Harlan Fitch. Cassian answered. "She's out of surgery," Harlan said. "The shoulder is repaired. The internal bleeding was significant, but we caught it. She's stable." The tarmac seemed to settle under Cassian's feet. "She'll recover," Harlan continued. "Full recovery is going to take time. Weeks for the shoulder, longer for everything else, depending on..." He paused, with the particular delicacy of a doctor who understood that everything else covered territory that was not his professional domain. "She's asking for you. Tell her..." Cassian stopped. What was there to tell her? That Gideon was in custody, that the ambush was dismantled, that Cassian had spent the drive to New Jersey doing the arithmetic on every moment of the last 4 years, and finding places where his certainty had cost her things she should never have had to lose. That an hour ago he'd held a USB drive containing 11 years of surveillance on his own life, conducted by his own uncle. And the primary feeling was not rage, but something closer to the vertigo of realizing the ground under your feet has been someone else's property the entire time. "Tell her I'm coming back," he said. He ended the call. Noah called back in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. "Okay." Noah's voice was the flattest Cassian had ever heard it. "So I have the access logs for the residential security system, the penthouse cameras, the floor sensors, the elevator logs." A pause. "They've been pulling data from the residential system for 8 years. 8 years. Elena and Cassian had been in the penthouse for 5.5. "The camera feeds," Cassian said. "Interior cameras. I'm looking at what was accessed and..." Another pause. "Boss, there are recordings. The system stores 30 days of interior footage, and the access logs show regular pulls going back to when Elena moved in. Whoever was on the other end of those access points was pulling the residential interior footage on a monthly basis." The tarmac was very cold. The gray light on the horizon hadn't moved. "Every private conversation," Cassian said. "Every meeting I held in the residence. Every..." "Yes." He thought about what Elena had said, standing in the penthouse foyer with that look on her face. The look of a woman trying to be believed by someone who had already decided not to believe her. He thought about how she had told him, directly, specifically, that she couldn't come to Cassian directly because she knew he would defend Gideon without proof. She'd been right, but she hadn't known about the cameras. She hadn't known that the reason Gideon had always seemed to know things, had always seemed to anticipate the next move, had always seemed to have information that arrived from no visible source, was that he had been watching, not occasionally, systematically, for 8 years. Every argument Cassian and Elena had ever had, every private conversation, every moment Elena had spent alone in that apartment trying to figure out what she'd found and who she could trust and how to protect the man who was going to be the last person to believe her. Gideon had watched all of it. "Pull everything," Cassian said. "The access logs, the footage pulls, the data records, all of it goes to a clean drive that never touches the main network. And then you burn the access points. Every one. Tonight." "Already burning them," Noah said. "Boss, there's one more thing." "Say it." "The person who called Gideon tonight, the block number, the 30-second call that tipped him off." Noah's voice was very careful now. "I traced the call origin. It bounced through 3 relays, but the origin point is a device registered to an account inside our own operation." Cassian's eyes were on the eastern horizon. "Who?" he said. The account belongs to the legal network. The one person Gideon mentioned on the drive as being inside your legal infrastructure." Noah paused. "It's Daniel Marsh." Daniel Marsh had been Cassian's primary attorney for 9 years. He had been present at every major structural decision the organization had made in that time. He had access to the financial architecture, the corporate paper, the trust structures, every contractual relationship the Rourke network maintained. He had called Gideon 40 minutes ago and given him enough warning to get to the airstrip. If Cassian's people had arrived 8 minutes later, Gideon would have been in the air. If Gideon had been in the air, the evidence on the USB drive would have been worthless without the man attached to it, because a drive full of names was only useful if you moved on those names before they had time to react, and Marsh would have already been making calls. "Marsh knows we have Gideon," Cassian said. "He made 2 more calls after the one to Gideon. I'm tracking them now, but they're bouncing and I need more time. He's already alerting the others on the list." "Almost certainly." Cassian turned and walked back toward the hangar where Marcus was securing Gideon and 2 of his men were standing in the specific posture of people waiting for direction. "Marcus?" he called. Marcus appeared in the hangar doorway. "Marsh," Cassian said. "Daniel Marsh. Right now. Tonight." Marcus's expression didn't change, which meant he had already suspected something like this was coming and had been thinking through the logistics. "He'll be at his apartment on Park. He's predictable at night. He doesn't travel when he's nervous. He goes home and manages by phone." Marcus was already reaching for his own phone. "But if he's already made 2 calls and the people on the other end are movable, how many people are on that drive in operations?" 4, you said. 4 operational people, 1 legal, 2 tech. 7 compromised positions minimum. If Marsh reaches all 4 in operations before we do, we lose the element of surprise on all of them and they go dark simultaneously," Marcus finished. Cassian reached the hangar doorway and stopped. The math was simple and catastrophic. He had 1 USB drive, 7 compromised positions, and one attorney who had already been on a phone for the last 20 minutes with a head start. He had 6 men in the field, 2 locations, and a 9-year relationship with a lawyer who understood the architecture of the Rourke operation at the level of its legal skeleton. The part you couldn't rebuild quickly, the part that took years to construct and could be used against you in ways that a bullet couldn't touch. And he had Elena, an hour out of surgery, in a clinic on the west side, asking for him. And he had Gideon in the back of Marcus's vehicle, still breathing, still potentially useful, still the only person in the world who knew the full scope of what he'd built inside Cassian's organization, because Gideon had built it himself. Cassian stood in the hangar doorway and looked at the gray horizon and understood that the night was not over, and the problem was not solved, and the enemy he had come here to remove had been, in the most important sense, only the visible part of something that went much deeper than one man with a leather bag and a prepaid Cessna. He put his phone to his ear. "Noah," he said, "I need you to lock Marsh's communications. Everything. Cell, email, encrypted apps, all of it. Can you do that without him knowing?" "If he's on a consumer network, yes. If he's using the encrypted channel we built for the legal team, I need about 6 minutes. Do both. And the foreign operations, same thing. Every communication channel they have that touches our infrastructure, lock it. That'll tip them that something happened." "Something happened," Cassian said. "They already know. Oh, I just need to control the pace." He turned back into the hangar. Gideon was sitting in the chair again, hands folded in his lap, with the specific stillness of a man who had made his gamble and lost, and was now waiting to discover the exact shape of the consequences. He looked up when Cassian came back in. Cassian pulled the second chair in front of him and sat down again. "Daniel Marsh," he said. Gideon's expression shifted. "He called you 20 minutes ago," Cassian said. 30-second conversation. He's been making calls since. He looked at his uncle steadily. "You built a 7-person network inside my operation. Marsh is the one who reaches the furthest into the structural layer. If he moves the right information to the right places, he can cause damage that outlasts anything you could have done by getting on that plane." Gideon was quiet. "I need you to call him," Cassian said. "And say what?" "Tell him to stand down. Tell him it's over and that cooperating is his only play." Cassian held his uncle's gaze. "I'm not asking you to do this because I'm giving you anything in return. I'm asking you because what Marsh does in the next hour could damage things that took 20 years to build. And I think some part of you, underneath everything you decided to do, doesn't actually want to burn it to the ground." Gideon looked at him for a long time. "You sound like your father," he said, finally, and it was the most complicated thing he'd said all night. He reached out his hand. Cassian put the phone in it. And in the gray pre-dawn of a New Jersey airstrip, Cassian Rourke watched his uncle make a call he hadn't been ordered to make, to a man who had already started a fire, trying with 11 words to put it out before it reached something that couldn't be rebuilt. The call lasted 40 seconds. Gideon handed the phone back. "He'll stand down," Gideon said. "Whether that's true, I can't guarantee, but I believe he understood the position." "Why did you help me just now?" Cassian said. Gideon looked down at his hands. "Because I built what you're trying to protect," he said. "And I'm old enough to know the difference between taking something for yourself and burning it so no one else can have it." He paused. "I wanted the Empire. I didn't want the rubble." Cassian stood up. He pocketed the phone. He looked at the man who had taught him everything he knew about trust and blood and loyalty, and who had spent 11 years demonstrating that none of those lessons had ever been offered without calculation behind them. "Marcus," he said, "take him to the secondary facility, not the estate, somewhere clean." He walked out of the hangar into the cold gray light of a morning that was beginning whether he was ready for it or not, and he thought about Elena waking up in a clinic room asking for a man who had spent the last several hours trying to hold together the pieces of a world that had been quietly undermined for a decade by someone who had helped him build it. He got in the G-Wagon. He started the engine. And as he pulled back onto the service road with the first thin light of dawn coming over the New Jersey tree line, his phone lit up with a message from Noah that contained 4 words. Marsh made a call. Cassian read it. Then he read the name Noah had attached below it. The person Marsh had reached before the communications lockdown hit. The one call that had gotten through in the window between Gideon's arrest and Noah's block. The one conversation that had traveled outside the network to a number that didn't exist in any of Cassian's records. He stopped the car in the middle of the service road. He read the name twice, and the ground shifted under everything he thought he'd just fixed, because the name on Noah's screen wasn't one of the 7 on the drive, wasn't someone Gideon had recruited or managed or maintained. It was someone who existed in a category Cassian had never thought to examine. Someone whose position made oversight nearly impossible, and whose access to the full operational picture was so complete and so normalized that Gideon wouldn't have needed to recruit them. They had come to Gideon, voluntarily, years ago, and Cassian had been handing them the keys ever since. Cassian sat in the middle of the service road with the engine running and Noah's message on his screen and the name below it doing something to the inside of his chest that he didn't have a clean word for. Marcus Webb. Not a name from the drive. Not one of Gideon's recruited assets or planted operatives. Marcus Webb, who had been at Cassian's side for 23 years. Marcus Webb, who had handed him the burner phone. Marcus Webb, who had been the first person to suggest Elena's guilt, who had been standing in the lobby when she walked out, who had been managing the field operation all night with the specific efficiency of a man who always seemed to know which piece of information to deliver at exactly the right moment. Marcus, who had driven with him to the clinic. Marcus, who was currently in a vehicle with Gideon Rourke heading to the secondary facility. Cassian's hand was already moving before the thought completed itself, dialing Doyle's cell, because Doyle was in the second vehicle, the one trailing Marcus, and Doyle's loyalty had been verified by cross-referencing financials that Cassian had pulled himself without routing through any shared system. Doyle picked up on the second ring. "Where are you?" Cassian said. "Route 1 southbound, about 4 miles behind Marcus's vehicle." "Close the gap. Don't let him know you're closing it." A pause, just a breath. Doyle was smart enough not to ask questions on an open line. "Understood," Doyle said. Cassian dropped the phone on the passenger seat and drove. He pushed the G-Wagon hard, back onto the main road and south, the same direction Marcus was heading, running the math in his head the way he'd been trained to run it. Not emotionally, not yet, because emotion was a luxury for after, and this was very much still during. The facts. Marcus had been with him for 23 years. Gideon had been building his network for 11. The overlap was 12 years where both men had been simultaneously inside Cassian's organization. Marcus had been Cassian's primary interface with Gideon, the person who managed communications between them, who scheduled the meetings, who was present at every significant conversation. The other fact, the one that lived underneath the math, Marcus had come to Cassian with the burner phone. He had been the one to bring it. He had been the one to frame Elena's guilt in those first critical minutes, when Cassian was still deciding what to believe, when the difference between listening and not listening was measured in seconds. He hadn't found the phone by accident. He had delivered it. Cassian had been holding the wheel so hard his hands were going numb, and he forced himself to ease the grip and breathe and think, because the next 30 minutes required him to be functional and cold and exactly right, because Gideon was in Marcus's vehicle, and Gideon was the only person alive who could confirm or deny what Noah's message suggested. And if Marcus understood that Gideon was about to be interrogated in a clean facility with Cassian present, his phone lit up. Noah. Marcus's vehicle just changed course, heading east on Route 9 instead of south toward the secondary facility. Cassian's jaw locked. He called Doyle. "He's changing course," Cassian said. "I see it. He's accelerating." "He knows." "How?" "He knows. Stay on him. Do not engage. Just stay visual." He ended the call and dialed Noah. "What's his destination on Route 9? He said. "Working it. He could be heading toward the bridge or—" "Wait." Noah's typing was audible, rapid. "There's a property on Route 9 East, Woodbridge Township. It's registered to another Gideon holding company, one that wasn't on the main drive. A secondary location. It wasn't in anything I found through the primary network." "Because Marcus fed it to the network selectively," Cassian said. "If he's been managing what Gideon's assets disclosed and what they didn't, then the drive Gideon gave me is incomplete." Cassian's voice was flat. "Gideon gave me a partial list, enough to look cooperative. The rest of it Marcus managed separately." "Boss," Noah's voice was very careful, "if there are people at that Woodbridge property who weren't on the drive, then Marcus is driving Gideon directly to them." The G-Wagon hit 90 on Route 1, and Cassian didn't touch the brake. He had 6 minutes on Marcus, maybe 7. Doyle had 4. The Woodbridge property was 12 minutes from the airstrip on Route 9 if you were driving at normal speed, 8 if you weren't. He called Reyes. I need you moving right now. Route 9 East, Woodbridge Township. He gave Reyes the address Noah pulled. Don't wait for me. Get eyes on the property and tell me how many vehicles and how many people. Moving, Reyes said. Then Cassian did something he hadn't done in 15 years of running the most powerful criminal organization between Boston and Philadelphia. He called Adrian Serrano. The phone rang 4 times, which was 3.5 times more than Cassian expected, given that Serrano was presumably also awake at 4:40 in the morning dealing with the aftermath of his own vehicle being shot up under a bridge. Mr. Rourke. Serrano's voice was alert and slightly medicated sounding, the way people sound when they've taken something for pain, but not enough to actually sleep. I have a problem, Cassian said. I need a resource I don't currently have positioned. A silence. Brief. What resource? Bodies, Route 9 in Woodbridge. How quickly? Another silence. Longer. I have people in Metuchen, Serrano said. 12 minutes. That's too long. Then you have a problem I can't solve faster than physics allows. A pause. How many on the other side? Unknown, at least 4 at this property. Possibly more depending on what Gideon built out there. And your side? Doyle, Reyes, and myself. Cars securing the airstrip. So 3 against unknown. Yes. Serrano was quiet for a moment. Then, my people will move now. Metuchen. They'll be behind you, but they'll be there. I'm not asking for... You're not asking, Serrano said. I'm offering. Your wife asked me 7 weeks ago to keep you alive. I'm going to consider that a standing instruction until she personally tells me otherwise. He paused. Don't die before my people get there. He ended the call. Cassian drove. The sky was lightening in a thin stripe along the horizon, the specific cold blue-gray of 5 a.m. in early winter, the light that makes everything look provisional and slightly unreal. The road was empty enough that he could see Doyle's headlights 2 miles ahead of him, which meant he was gaining. His phone buzzed. Reyes. On the property, Reyes said, his voice low and tight. I've got 3 vehicles in the lot. Lights on inside the main building. I can see movement through the windows. At least 4, maybe 6 people. Armed. At least 2 visible. Probably more inside. Doyle's 2 minutes behind Marcus. I'm 4 behind Doyle. Marcus doesn't know I'm here. Came in from the east approach on foot. Hold your position until I get there. Boss, Reyes's voice dropped lower. They've got someone else in there. I can see through the window from this angle. There's a person seated, hands behind them, not standing, not moving under their own direction. Cassian's hands tightened. Can you make an ID? Too far, wrong angle. But they've been there since before Marcus arrived. This isn't a meeting point. It's a holding location. Cassian drove faster. The pieces were rearranging themselves in his head with the rapid, slightly nauseating quality of a picture coming into focus that you had not wanted to see. Gideon had known, from the camera feeds, from 11 years of watching, that Cassian's first move after the hospital would be to go after him. Gideon had prepared for it. Not just the airstrip. The airstrip was a distraction, or a fallback, the real contingency, the one he'd managed through Marcus rather than through the visible network, was the Woodbridge property. The person seated inside with their hands behind them. Cassian thought about Elena, out of surgery, asking for him. He thought about what Harlan had said, stable, recovering. He thought about the residential security camera feeds that Gideon had been pulling for 8 years. Gideon had watched her figure out the conspiracy. He'd watched her make the decision to contact Serrano. He'd watched every step of it through her own home's cameras. And if he'd built a contingency around her... Reyes, Cassian said. The person being held. Approximate build. A pause. Reyes moving position. Female, Reyes said. Smaller frame, dark hair from what I can see. Cassian's blood stopped. She's supposed to be in the clinic, he said, and his voice didn't sound like his voice. It sounded like something produced by a machine that was trying to replicate the sound of a human voice from incomplete data. I know, Reyes said, but boss, she's not. He drove the next 4 minutes in a state that was not quite thought and not quite feeling, but was something that operated below both of those, something older and more basic, The thing that runs a body when the mind is processing information too catastrophic to integrate in real time. Elena had been in surgery. Harlan had called. She was stable. She was asking for him. The call from Harlan. He pulled up the call log, pulled up Harlan's contact, dialed, 4 rings, 5. Voicemail. He dialed the clinic's direct line, the one that bypassed the standard answering system and went to the duty desk. Picked up on the second ring. A voice he didn't recognize. Rourke Medical. Who is this? Cassian said. Dr. Fitch asked me to cover the desk while he put Harlan on the phone. A pause. Movement sounds on the other end, then, he stepped out about 40 minutes ago. There was a call that came in and he said he needed to. Cassian ended the call. Marcus. Marcus had been in the vehicle with Cassian when Harlan called. Marcus, who had been running communications all night, who had access to the clinic's contact chain, who could have routed a call through Harlan's number using the same communication infrastructure he'd been managing for 11 years. The call hadn't been from Harlan. Elena had never said she was asking for him. He had heard that from a voice on a phone, in a vehicle, at 4 in the morning, when he was operating on no sleep and catastrophic emotional overload. And he had believed it because he had needed to believe it, because it had been the one thing that night that had felt like grace instead of consequence. He should have called the clinic himself. He should have verified. He had been sloppy in the one moment that mattered most. He hit the steering wheel with the heel of his hand once, hard enough to feel it up to his elbow. Then he stopped feeling it and drove. Doyle's voice came through on the phone. Marcus is pulling into the property now. He's not looking around. He thinks he's clean. I'm 90 seconds out. Don't move until I'm there. He's taking Gideon inside. I said don't move. He came in from the east, same approach Reyes had used, cutting the lights a quarter mile from the property and navigating by the ambient glow of the building's windows. The property was a low commercial building, the kind that looked like it had been a light manufacturing facility at some point in the last 30 years. Flat roof, a loading bay along the south face, 3 windows along the east wall showing the interior light that Reyes had described. He parked behind a stand of trees at the property line and was moving on foot before the engine cooled. Reyes materialized out of the dark at his elbow, which was one of Reyes's better qualities. The man moved like he'd been born in the shadows between things. Marcus took Gideon in through the main entrance 2 minutes ago, Reyes said, barely above a breath. They're in a room toward the back. The woman is in the same room. I counted 5 people total, not including Marcus and Gideon. Doyle. South side, waiting. How's the back entrance? Single door, no visible coverage. The camera on the east wall is pointed at the parking area, not the building perimeter. Cassian looked at the building for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was what he had, because Marcus was inside now, and Marcus would understand very quickly from the atmosphere in that room that Gideon's plan had gone wrong in ways that the 30-second call from Marsh hadn't fully conveyed, and when Marcus understood that, the calculation in that room was going to change. Back entrance, Cassian said. You and me. Doyle comes in the south on my signal. They moved. The ground between the tree line and the building's back wall was 40 feet of gravel and dead grass, the kind of surface that made noise when you crossed it wrong. Cassian moved the way he hadn't moved in years. Low, fast, weight forward onto the balls of his feet, the full concentration of muscle memory from a period of his life he thought was mostly behind him. His shoulder ached from an old injury that always made itself known in cold weather. He ignored it. They reached the back wall. The door had a standard commercial lock. Reyes had it open in 40 seconds with a pick set that he carried with the casual practicality of someone who had needed it often enough that going without felt irresponsible. They went in. The back of the building was a storage corridor, metal shelving, cardboard boxes, the smell of industrial cleaner and old insulation. A single fluorescent tube overhead, one end flickering. The voices were coming from a room at the far end of the corridor, past a junction with a second hallway. Cassian could hear Marcus's voice. Not the words, not yet, just the cadence, the specific rhythm of a man delivering a controlled situation report to people who were waiting for one. He'd heard that voice in that mode thousands of times, and had always found it reassuring. The competence of it. The way Marcus could walk into any room and establish order through tone alone before anything else. He heard it differently now. He moved to the junction and stopped with his back to the wall and listened. Changed the timeline. The airstrip is compromised. Gideon is intact, but we need to move the secondary option forward. Marcus's voice, crisp and operational. The leverage we have in that room is the only card left. Rourke will come here. He won't have a choice. A second voice, male, unfamiliar. How long? He's maybe 20 minutes behind me. He has 3 people in the field, possibly a Serrano asset en route, but too far out to matter. A pause. We use her to bring him in without a fight, and we use Gideon as confirmation that the transfer of operational authority is legitimate, clean. And Rourke himself. A silence. That's not your decision, Marcus said. Cassian's jaw was so tight, it was sending pressure up behind his eye sockets. He breathed through it. He kept his body still and his mind running because the rage was a resource only if he controlled it, only if it stayed in the fuel line and didn't flood the engine. He held up 3 fingers to Reyes, then pointed to the room, then held up 1 finger and tapped his own chest. Reyes understood. 3 in the room, Cassian goes first. He sent a single-word text to Doyle, now, and he came around the corner. The room was larger than the corridor had suggested, the full width of the building's back section, with exposed structural columns and the remnants of a manufacturing layout that had been stripped down to bare concrete. 5 men, not counting Marcus, positioned in the loose formation of people who had been waiting in a space they knew and owned. 2 near the entrance on the south side, those would be Doyle's. 2 along the east wall, 1 near the back. Marcus was standing in the center of the room, halfway between the entrance and the back wall, with Gideon beside him and his hand on Gideon's arm, in the posture of a man managing an asset rather than escorting a prisoner. Against the back wall, in a metal chair, with her wrists secured behind her and a cut above the same temple that had been bleeding earlier, was Elena. Her head came up when Cassian entered the room. The room moved fast after that. Not cleanly. Nothing about it was clean. The man near the south entrance went for his weapon and Cassian was already moving, crossing the distance at a run and hitting the man before the weapon cleared the holster, driving him into the concrete column with enough force that the sound it made was wrong, and the man went down and didn't immediately try to get back up. The second south side man had his weapon out, but Doyle came through the south entrance in the same moment, and Cassian heard the specific sound of 2 bodies in sudden physics-driven contact, and then the weapon skating across concrete. The 2 east wall men came forward. Reyes came out of the corridor behind Cassian, and things happened in the east wall corner that were rapid and not entirely visible from Cassian's angle, and resulted in both men on the floor within about 8 seconds, one of them making noise about it, and one of them not. The man at the back of the room, the one positioned nearest Elena, had his weapon up and leveled at a point roughly between Cassian and the room's center. Everyone stopped. The room smelled like concrete and sweat and something sharp and metallic. Someone was breathing hard. Several someones. Cassian was breathing hard, the kind of hard that comes after a burst of movement, and his shoulder was making itself aggressively known, and he was standing 8 feet from a man with a weapon pointed in the general direction of everyone he cared about in this room. "Put it down," Cassian said. His voice came out with effort. Not shaking, not loud, but effortful. The man with the gun was young, late 20s, the kind of young that still has something to prove and therefore does not always make decisions calibrated to survival. I was looking at the room with the expression of someone who had prepared for several scenarios and was discovering that the actual scenario was adjacent to but not identical to any of them. "I put this down, and then what?" the young man said. "Then you walk out of here," Cassian said, "and you make better choices for the rest of whatever length of life you're interested in having." A pause. Marcus, Cassian said without looking away from the gun, "is no longer in a position to say anything that's relevant to your immediate future." He heard Marcus shift behind him, and he heard Doyle respond to that shift with a single sharp word, and Marcus stopped. The young man with the gun looked at the room, at the 5 people on the floor, at Reyes standing with the particular stillness of someone who was going to move very fast the instant the geometry changed, at Cassian standing between him and the only functional exit. He put the gun down. He put his hands up. Cassian said, "Reyes," and Reyes moved the young man to the east wall, and that piece was done. Cassian turned. Marcus Webb was standing in the center of the room with Doyle behind him, and his hands at his sides and an expression on his face that Cassian had never seen there before, which was notable because Cassian had 23 years of Marcus Webb expressions cataloged in his memory, and he had believed he'd seen all of them. This one was grief. Not performed, not calculated. Actual grief. The kind that lives in the face differently than regret or fear or defiance. A specific quality of loss, like a man who has arrived at the end of something that was real to him even as he was in the process of destroying it. Cass, Marcus said. Don't, Cassian said. I need you to hear, I said don't. His voice cracked on the second word, just slightly, just enough. Get him to the chair. Doyle moved Marcus to the second chair that was in the room, a matching metal chair that had been sitting against the east wall unoccupied, which, given that the room had been set up with Elena restrained in one chair, told Cassian something about what had been planned for the second one. He walked to Elena. She was watching him with eyes that were alert despite everything, alert and exhausted and holding something behind them that would have to wait until there was space for it. The cut on her temple had stopped bleeding, but the dried blood was stark against her pale face. Her shoulder, the surgical shoulder, was held at an angle that suggested she was managing the pain by limiting its movement range. He crouched in front of her and took her face in both hands, the way he'd done on the wet concrete under the bridge, checking her eyes, checking her color, doing the rapid assessment of someone who needed to know the status of something they could not afford to lose. Are you hurt? He said. Beyond... I'm okay. Her voice was rough. They moved me about an hour after surgery. They did something to Harlan, Cassian. He was trying to stop them, and I'll find him. He was already working the restraints behind her. Simple zip ties, the commercial grade, and he had a folding knife in his inside pocket that had them off in 4 seconds. Her hands came forward, and she winced hard and grabbed the back of his arm with fingers that were cold and stiff. Gideon, she said. Secured. Marcus, I know. She looked at his face, reading him the way she always did, the way that had always mildly unnerved him, the way he had for 4 years simultaneously appreciated and been made slightly uncomfortable by. How long have you known? She said. About Marcus. About 40 minutes. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. Something moved across her face that wasn't surprise. I suspected, she said. I couldn't prove it. It was why I couldn't go through the organization's internal channels to warn you. I didn't know who was... She stopped. I didn't know who was clean. So you went to Serrano. So I went to Serrano. She held his eyes. I know how that looked. It looked like you were trying to save my life, Cassian said. That's what it looked like. I was wrong about what I thought it looked like. She didn't respond to that. She looked at his face a moment longer, then looked past him at Marcus sitting in the metal chair across the room with Doyle behind him and his hands folded in his lap. Talk to him, she said. You need to understand how deep it goes. Elena, I'll be fine for 20 minutes. Reyes is here. She looked at him with the expression that he had always privately categorized as the look she used when she had decided something and was waiting for him to catch up to the decision. Talk to him, Cassian. You need everything he knows. He stood. He crossed the room to the chair where Marcus sat. He pulled a crate from the wall and sat on it, close, the same proximity he'd used with Gideon at the airstrip, because distance was for people you were done with, and Marcus Webb had 23 years behind him that Cassian needed to understand before he could be done with any of it. Marcus was looking at the floor. Look at me, Cassian said. Marcus looked up. His face was the face of a 51-year-old man who had spent his adult life in rooms where the wrong choice meant permanent consequences, and who was now sitting in a room where he had made the wrong choice and was processing the specific quality of that. How long? Cassian said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. 8 years, he said. 8. The same number as the camera feeds from the penthouse, the same window. Gideon approached you. No. Marcus's voice was low, even, the affect of a man who had decided he was going to be honest now, after everything, because there was nothing left that dishonesty could protect. I approached him 8 years ago, after your father's estate distribution was finalized and it was clear the structure was going to continue the way it had been running and I was going to continue being what I was. He paused. I'd been doing the actual operational management of this organization for 6 years by then. Every relationship, every deal, every problem that got solved quietly. And I was Marcus. I was the man beside the man, the one nobody feared. Nobody feared you because I made sure they respected you. You made sure they respected you and tolerated me because I was with you. Marcus's voice had something in it that wasn't quite bitterness, wasn't quite truth, lived somewhere between the two. That's not the same thing, and you know it. Cassian said nothing. I went to Gideon because he'd been making overtures for months. Not direct, not explicit. Just the way Gideon does things, creating proximity and opportunity and letting you make the move. And I made it. Marcus looked at his hands. I gave him the tech access, the camera feeds, the communication infrastructure, the financial tracking, in exchange for what? A position, a real one. When the transition happened, when Gideon took over, I was supposed to be the operational head, not the man beside the man. The man. The room was very quiet. You were going to help kill me, Cassian said, to get a title. It wasn't... Marcus stopped. Yes. Functionally, yes. I told myself the details of how it happened weren't my responsibility, that my role was the before and the after and not the... He stopped again. His jaw worked. I told myself that for 8 years, and I mostly believed it. Right up until last night when I was standing in that lobby and you told Elena to get out and she walked into that elevator and He looked up. I thought about pulling that phone before I brought it to you. I thought about it for about 4 seconds on the elevator ride up, and I didn't. Because you needed me to send her out. Because I needed her out of the picture before she could tell you about Gideon, yes. His voice was flat and honest in the way of a man delivering testimony against himself. She'd been getting close to the full picture for about 3 weeks. Gideon knew it from the feeds. He told me to manage it. The phone was already planted. That was one of Gideon's operational assets, placed the week before. I just needed to be the one to find it at the right moment. Cassian sat with that. 3 weeks. Elena had been 3 weeks from having enough to bring him proof, and the network around him had manufactured a crisis and used Cassian's own certainty as the delivery mechanism. She told me, Cassian said, in that hallway. She told me Gideon was planning something. I didn't listen. I know. Marcus's voice was very quiet. I was watching you decide not to listen. The words landed like something physical. And you said nothing, Cassian said. No. Marcus held his gaze. I said nothing. Cassian stood up. The crate scraped against the concrete. He walked 3 steps away from Marcus and stood with his back to him and his face toward the east wall, and he took 3 breaths. The deliberate kind, the kind you take when you're trying to keep something from breaking loose that will be very difficult to reassemble if it does. 23 years. The man who had found him when he was 19 and handed him his first real operational lesson. The man who had been at his shoulder at his father's funeral. The man who had, 6 years ago, sat with Cassian in an emergency room for 4 hours when Cassian had taken a bullet in the hip in a botched meeting in Baltimore and had held his phone and kept his coffee hot and run the organization's communications from a plastic waiting room chair without being asked. The man who had stood in a lobby and handed him a planted phone and watched him send his wife into the cold. Gideon's full network, Cassian said, without turning around. Everything that wasn't on the drive, every person, every access point, every resource you managed separately, all of it. A pause. Yes, Marcus said. And Marsh, what he knows. Everything I know, Marsh knows. He was the legal architecture. I was the operational. We've been running parallel tracks for 6 years. Anyone else outside those 7? 2 more. I kept them off everything, even Gideon's records. They're mine. I recruited them independently. A pause. I'll give you the names. You'll give me the names right now, Cassian said. Marcus gave him the names. Cassian took out his phone and texted them to Noah without commentary, and Noah responded in 40 seconds with a single thumbs up that meant he was already running the communication lockdown. Then Cassian turned around. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, the man he'd trusted more consistently and more deeply than any other person in his adult life, sitting in a metal chair in a stripped manufacturing facility in Woodbridge, New Jersey, having just dismantled the last piece of the architecture he'd spent 8 years building alongside the man who was now deciding what to do with him. The thing that I keep coming back to, Cassian said, is that you already had what you wanted. You had more real authority than any title Gideon could have given you. You ran the organization. You had my trust. You had everything that actually matters in this world. He paused. And you decided it wasn't enough because your name wasn't at the top of the paper. Marcus looked at him without flinching. You know exactly what that feels like, Marcus said. You inherited the paper. You've always had your name at the top of it. You've never had to wonder what you are when the name isn't there. The words sat in the air. Cassian didn't answer them. Not because they weren't true. They were in the specific way that things said in grief and honesty often are, even when the person saying them has forfeited the right to be heard, but because the truth of them didn't change anything that had happened. Doyle, Cassian said. Doyle stepped forward. Cassian reached into his coat pocket and produced the USB drive Gideon had given him at the airstrip. Give this to Noah. He knows what to do with it. He paused. And call the clinic. Find out what happened to Harlan Fitch and get medical to wherever he is. Doyle took the drive, nodded once, and moved. Serrano's people arrived 11 minutes later, 4 of them, quiet and professional, coming through the south entrance with the contained efficiency of a crew that had been well briefed and well deployed. They looked at the room with the expressions of people who had expected something chaotic and found something that had already been resolved, which seemed to mildly surprise them. Their lead man, a compact guy in his mid-30s who introduced himself only as Vega, looked at Cassian and then at Elena, who was on her feet now, standing against the east wall with Reyes beside her, and her good hand pressed flat against her ribs in the posture of someone managing a quantity of pain they've decided isn't worth mentioning. Serrano sends his regards, Vega said. He wants to know if the situation is contained. Tell him we have a secondary list of 9 people to move on before morning. Cassian looked at him steadily. I can use his people or mine, but it needs to happen in the next 2 hours, or the window closes. Vega looked at him for a moment. I'll call him, Vega said. While Vega made the call, Cassian crossed to Elena. She watched him come. She was still using the wall, subtly, with the practiced invisibility of someone who didn't want to announce that they needed it, and her face was the specific color of a person who has been awake for too long while simultaneously recovering from surgery and being involuntarily relocated across a river. Harlan, she said. Doyle's finding him. And Marcus. Secured. She nodded. Looked at the floor for a moment, then back up at him. Her eyes were dark and steady and exhausted. I need to sit down, she said. I've been not saying that for about 40 minutes. He got her to the chair that Reyes dragged over, the right chair this time, not the one with the zip tie marks on the arms, and she sat in it with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating physical pain while trying to maintain the appearance of navigating it less than they are. He crouched beside the chair. She looked at him. He didn't know what he wanted to say. He knew what needed to be said. There was a very long conversation that needed to happen between them, one that required more space and more quiet, and more of something he hadn't figured out how to call yet. But the room was not the space for it, and 5 a.m. in a New Jersey industrial facility was not the time. When this is done, he said. When this is done, she agreed. Vega came back. Serrano authorizes assistance. He wants the operation run joint. His people take 3, yours take 6. Agreed, Cassian said. He stood up. He looked at the room, the people on the floor, the people on their feet, Marcus in the chair, and Gideon against the far wall with Doyle's hand on his shoulder, Reyes and Serrano's 4, the stripped-down reality of a plan that had been years in the making and had arrived at this specific room at this specific hour through a sequence of decisions and consequences that he was going to be reckoning with for a very long time. His phone showed 5:19 a.m. In 4 hours, the city would be fully awake. In 4 hours, the Rourke organization's 9 remaining compromised positions would be receiving visits from people who had the authorization and the capability to end their operational usefulness permanently. In 4 hours, the structural damage that Marcus and Gideon had spent 8 years accumulating inside the organization's intelligence layer would either be contained or it would not, and the difference between those 2 outcomes would determine whether the Rourke operation survived the next 6 months intact or spent the next 6 months bleeding from wounds it hadn't been able to cauterize in time. But right now, in this room, at 5:19 in the morning, the immediate threat was alive and secured, and the woman who had spent 7 weeks trying to prevent everything that had happened tonight was sitting in a metal chair with her shoulder in a sling she'd improvised from her own sleeve, and her eyes tracking him with the patient, slightly wrecked attention of someone who had decided they were going to wait and see what happened next. He had sent her out into freezing rain because he was certain he was right. He had been catastrophically wrong. She had gone to his greatest enemy, negotiated in secret, risked everything she had in the world, taken a bullet, been moved from a surgical table to a metal chair in the middle of the night. And she was still in that chair watching him, waiting, not because she owed him anything, but because she had made a decision about what she was and what he was to her, and she had not revoked that decision even when he had given her every reason to. Cassian turned to Vega. Vega, let's move, he said. And the last phase of the longest night of his life began. The 9 visits happened between 6 and 8:15 in the morning. Cassian ran them from the G-Wagon, parked on a side street in Hoboken with a direct line to Noah's feed, coordinating 6 teams across 2 boroughs and 1 county, while Elena slept in the back seat with Reyes's jacket folded under her head and the slow, shallow breathing of someone whose body had finally overruled her will and taken what it needed. He watched her sleep for about 4 seconds when he first noticed it. Then he looked back at his phone. The 9 positions were a mix of operational and structural. 4 field-level managers who had been feeding Gideon movement and logistics data, 2 financial controllers who had been quietly redirecting small fractions of revenue into accounts. Marcus maintained the legal backup Marsh had activated before the lockdown hit, and the 2 tech layer assets Noah had identified through the access logs. The 9th was a woman named Sandra Choi, who worked in the document management division, and who had been, for 6 years, making copies of contract filings and physical records, and passing them to a Gideon-controlled storage location in Red Hook. Sandra Choi was 53 years old and had been with the organization's legitimate front companies for 11 years, and when Cassian's people arrived at her apartment in Jackson Heights at 6:47, she was already awake, already dressed, already sitting at her kitchen table with her hands folded on top of it, in the posture of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this knock for a very long time. She told them she was sorry. His team leader reported this back to Cassian verbatim, with the slightly uncertain quality of someone who wasn't sure how the emotional content was supposed to be logged, and Cassian said to process her the same as the others and move to the next call. By 8:15, all 9 were secured. By 8:40, Noah had the preliminary damage assessment ready and delivered it over the phone in the clipped, efficient manner he used when the information was bad but survivable, which was, Noah had explained to Cassian once, a genuinely different delivery mode from the information that was bad and not survivable, and Cassian should trust him to make that distinction. The damage was bad. It was survivable. The financial exposure would take 3 months to fully audit and remediate. The legal architecture needed to be rebuilt from scratch in 4 key areas where Marsh had intentionally introduced vulnerabilities in the document structure. Nothing that couldn't be corrected, but corrections that required finding a new primary attorney and then spending a significant amount of time and money undoing 8 years of quiet sabotage embedded in contracts and trust structures. The intelligence infrastructure required a full rebuild because there was no clean way to know which systems Marcus had touched and which he hadn't without auditing all of them, which Noah estimated would take 6 to 8 weeks. The operational network was largely intact. The 4 field-level managers had been mid-tier. Their removal created gaps, not ruptures. And the Serrano Territory Agreement, Cassian said. What about it? Elena negotiated the Northern Corridor. That agreement stands. I want it formalized in writing and delivered to Serrano's legal team by end of week. A pause from Noah's end. That's going to cost... I know what it costs, Cassian said. Make it happen. He ended the call and sat in the driver's seat for a while with the engine off, watching the morning traffic build on the street outside. Normal morning traffic. Commuters, delivery vehicles, a woman walking 2 dogs that were going in different directions and didn't seem to have reached a consensus about it. The city assembling itself for an ordinary day on top of a night that had been anything but. Elena stirred in the back seat. He heard the change in her breathing, the shift from sleep rhythm to the slight tension of someone orienting themselves to an unfamiliar location. Then silence, while she ran through whatever internal inventory she ran when she woke up somewhere unexpected. Cassian. Her voice was rough and low. Here. What time is it? Almost 9. A sound that might have been a response, or might have been a response to the pain of adjusting her shoulder. Then, is it over? The immediate part. She was quiet for a moment. Harlan, she said. He's okay. They used a sedative. They needed him out of the clinic without a scene. He woke up in a storage room about 2 hours ago, very unhappy, but physically fine. He paused. He's threatening to quit. Can you blame him? No. Another silence. I need to sit up, she said. If you could... He got out of the driver's seat and opened the rear door and helped her sit upright with the careful, specific attention of someone who had been told by a surgeon exactly which movements were acceptable and which were not, and was trying to honor that information precisely. She winced twice, and he felt both of them in his own chest. She sat with her back against the door and her legs across the seat and looked at him. Her husband, crouched in the open door of an SUV on a side street in Hoboken in the early morning, still in last night's clothes, with dried blood on his collar from his split knuckles, and the look of a man who had not slept and was not going to sleep for a while yet, and knew it. You need to tell me things, she said. Yes. All of it. Not the version where you decide what I need to know. All of it, he agreed. She held his gaze for a moment, checking it the way she always checked things, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing that she was doing it. Okay, she said. He told her. He told her about the USB drive and the 11 years of camera feeds and what Gideon had been watching from inside the penthouse for the entire span of their marriage. He watched her face process that, the specific quality of violation that moves across a person when they discover that private moments they believed were their own were not, that the rooms they thought were safe were being observed by a specific kind of patient, calculating attention. She didn't say anything for a long time after that part. He told her about Marcus, all of it, including the part where Marcus had specifically engineered the timing of the phone's discovery to coincide with the moment Elena had been closest to having enough proof to bring to Cassian directly. He watched her absorb the confirmation of something she had apparently suspected but not been able to verify, and he watched the way she sat with that information, not with the satisfaction of being right, which was what he would have expected, but with something that looked more like sorrow, like she had been hoping she was wrong. He told her about the call from Serrano that had saved him, about the airstrip and Gideon in the chair, and the things his uncle had said about Cassian's father and succession and 30 years of accumulated grievance dressed as principle. He told her about the moment in the hangar when Gideon had looked at him and said, "You sound like your father," and what that had cost him to hear in the context of everything else. He told her about the name on Noah's screen, about Marcus's 8 years, about what Marcus had said, "I've never had to wonder what you are when the name isn't there," and he told her he didn't have a clean answer for it and wasn't going to pretend he did. He told her about standing in that Woodbridge room watching her sit in a chair with her shoulder wrecked and her hands free and her eyes tracking him across a room full of people she didn't know and what he had thought in that moment. He stopped there. Elena was looking at the window, not at him, at the traffic outside, the ordinary morning assembling itself around them. "The cameras," she said, "in the apartment. I'm having them removed today. The entire system is being replaced with one Noah builds from scratch." "It's not just about the system," she said. "I know. For 4 years I've been living in a home that was being watched by someone who was trying to destroy my husband, and the cameras were running because of a security apparatus that you controlled, and I had no say in and no visibility into." She said it evenly, not as an accusation, as a statement of fact. "I couldn't protect myself. I couldn't protect you. I didn't have the information or the access to do either. I had to go outside the organization entirely to find someone who could actually help. You went to Serrano because you had no one inside who was safe to go to," Cassian said. "I went to Serrano because you had built a structure around us where the only person I was supposed to trust was you, and the people around you were compromised, and you were the last person I could tell." She turned to look at him. "Do you understand what that felt like?" "No," he said. "I'm trying to." She looked at him for a moment. The look wasn't cold, wasn't warm. It was honest, which was more demanding than either of those. "When you opened the elevator," she said, "when you said what you said, I know." "Let me finish." Her voice was quiet. "I knew I was right. I knew what was on that phone, and I knew what I'd done and why. And I still stood there and thought, for about 4 seconds, that you were going to take it back, that you were going to stop the doors." She paused. "And when you didn't, I thought, he will never know what I was trying to do. And that was the worst part, not the cold, not being alone. The thought that you would go through whatever Gideon had planned for you not knowing that I had tried to stop it." Cassian was quiet. And then Adrian's car pulled up, she said. And I got in because there was nowhere else to go. And I spent the next 40 minutes in the back of that car with a man I'd been negotiating with for 7 weeks over the phone and had never actually met. And he gave me his coat without saying anything about it. And I thought, she stopped. Her jaw worked. I thought, this is the enemy, and he's treating me better than my husband just did. Cassian looked at his hands. I know, he said. I need you to know that knowing it isn't enough, she said. I need you to understand the difference. He looked up. Tell me the difference, he said. Knowing it is information, she said. Understanding it is something you carry. It changes how you move through rooms. It changes what you check before you act. She held his gaze. Knowing you were wrong doesn't rebuild anything. Understanding how you got there, understanding the specific machinery of it, the assumptions and the habits and the things you told yourself, that's the part that might. He sat with that. The traffic moved outside. The dogs from earlier came back around the block, still going in different directions, their owner apparently having achieved some kind of ambulatory compromise with them. The structure of the organization, Cassian said. I'm changing it. Tell me. No family member receives automatic trust because of blood. That principle is gone. It should have been gone years ago. He paused. You'll have direct access to security intelligence and financial information. Not filtered through me or anyone else, direct. Your own access, your own analysts if you want them. She was looking at him. That's not a compensation, he said. That's a correction. You were operating blind inside your own home because I had built a structure that treated you as someone to be protected rather than someone who could protect. You proved that was wrong at significant personal cost. He paused. I'm not asking you to accept the change as an apology. It's just accurate. You're not going to ask me to forgive you, she said. It wasn't quite a question. No. Why not? Because you don't owe me that on a timeline, he said. What happened? What I did? I can't make an argument for it that makes it less than it was. I could list the pressures and the information I had, and the history with Gideon and all the things that made the decision feel like the right one in that moment, and every one of those things would be true, and none of them would change the fact that I put you in danger that you should never have been in, and that you were trying to tell me something important, and I chose not to hear it. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking to be allowed to do better, in specific, measurable ways over time that you can evaluate for yourself. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then something moved in her face, not softening exactly, more like the specific release of a tension that has been held for so long it has become structural, and when it releases, the face underneath is different from the face that was there before. Okay, she said. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Okay. The word that meant I am willing to see what happens next, which was, in Cassian's experience, the hardest thing any person ever offered to another. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Her fingers were still cold and still stiff from the restraints, and he held them carefully, the way you hold something that has been through more than it was supposed to be put through and is still, improbably, intact. They sat like that for a while, in the back of a parked SUV in Hoboken, while Manhattan assembled itself across the river and the morning got on with the business of being morning. The drive back to the city took 20 minutes. Cassian drove, Elena in the back seat, and neither of them talked much. There was too much to say for the 20-minute version of it, and they both knew it. He took her to a private medical facility, not the clinic, a different location, one he'd had Noah verify was clean before they left Hoboken. A suite, not a room, with a window that looked onto a courtyard where the winter sunlight was doing its best with limited material. Harlan Fitch arrived 45 minutes later, looking worse than Elena did and significantly more aggrieved, and spent 10 minutes making his feelings about the events of the previous night comprehensively clear before settling into the clinical professionalism that had always made him worth the considerable aggravation of his personality. The shoulder will heal, Harlan said. The incision held, which is frankly a miracle given that she was moved 12 hours post-surgery, and whoever secured her wrists should be grateful I'm a doctor and not a prosecutor. He looked at Cassian with the expression of a man who has spent 2 decades working in morally complex environments and has not made peace with all of it. 6 weeks minimum before full mobility, no stress on the joint, no overexertion, and I mean that in every possible sense of the phrase. He left. Cassian sat in the chair beside Elena's bed, the chair that doctors always put beside hospital beds for the person who's going to be there anyway, so they might as well be comfortable. And for the first time in approximately 19 hours, he stopped moving. The stillness arrived like a physical thing, like weight, like the accumulated momentum of a night's worth of running and deciding and not feeling finally catching up with the man who had generated it. Elena was watching him from the bed. "Sleep," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not even close to fine. You look like something the city used and put back in the wrong cabinet." She paused. "There's a couch against the wall. Harlan said you could use it." "Harlan said I could—" "I asked him, preemptively." She held his gaze. "I knew you weren't going to leave." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I'm not." He slept on the couch for 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep he'd had in a week. When he woke up, Elena was awake, reading something on a tablet that someone had brought her, and the winter sunlight through the courtyard window had moved to the other side of the room. She looked up when he sat up. "Noah called," she said. "Twice. Also Vega, Serrano's man, called to confirm the morning operation finished clean. And Doyle sent a text that says, quote, 'All 9 are where they belong. Also, I need a vacation. Also, please tell Mrs. Rourke she has excellent tactical instincts.'" Cassian looked at her. "I may have given Doyle some information during the drive to Woodbridge," she said, "about the east approach to the property, based on the layout description Reyes gave me before I was moved." She looked back at her tablet with the expression of someone who is not quite suppressing satisfaction. "I've been listening to how your people describe locations for 4 years. I know what the relevant details are." He sat on the edge of the couch and rubbed his face with both hands. "You gave Doyle tactical information about the property where you were being held," he said, "while recovering from surgery, in the back of a car." Someone had to. He dropped his hands and looked at her. She looked back at him over the tablet with something in her eyes that was close to the look she had given him in that penthouse hallway, in what felt like a different century. The look of a woman who had decided something and was waiting for him to catch up. "The structure you said you were changing," she said. "The direct access to intelligence and financial information." "Yes." "I want to be in the room," she said. "Not briefed afterward, not given a summary. In the room, when the significant decisions get made. You'll be in the room. And I want my own people, independent of the existing structure. 2 or 3, vetted by me, reporting to me, not looped into the main network." "Done." She held his gaze. "You're agreeing very quickly." "I'm agreeing because you're right," he said. "And because if you'd had independent resources 7 weeks ago, none of last night would have happened." He paused. "I should have built this structure 4 years ago. I didn't because I was—" He stopped. "I was operating on the same principle Gideon spent 30 years teaching me. You keep power concentrated. You limit access. You control information at the center." He looked at her. "It nearly got us both killed." "It got me shot," she said with a precision that was not unkind but was also not soft. "It got you shot," he said, "and I am going to spend a significant portion of the rest of my life aware of that." She set the tablet down on the bed beside her and looked at him with the full attention she reserved for things that actually mattered. "I don't want you to spend the rest of your life aware of it," she said. "I want you to spend the rest of your life doing something different because of it. Those aren't the same thing." "No," he said, "they're not." The meeting with Adrian Serrano happened 11 days later, in a private dining room in a midtown restaurant that had been serving the kind of clientele who required privacy and asked no questions for about 40 years. Neutral ground, established by a mutual contact who existed in the gray area where the two organizations had always overlapped without acknowledgement. Serrano arrived exactly on time, which Cassian noted as characteristic. He was moving carefully. The injury from the waterfront was still affecting his left side, a fact he was managing with the same quality of controlled minimization that Cassian recognized from his own relationship with the hip he'd damaged 6 years ago. They were, in this specific way, and probably no others, similar kinds of men. They sat. The restaurant sent food neither of them ordered. They ate some of it. Cassian placed the territorial agreement on the table, the formalized version of what Elena had negotiated in 7 weeks of encrypted messages from a burner phone in the pocket of a coat she wore on Saturdays to the farmer's market. The Northern Corridor, documented properly, signed by Cassian and witnessed by the mutual contact who was doing everyone the favor of not being curious about what he was witnessing. Serrano looked at it without picking it up. Elena's negotiation, he said. Elena's agreement, Cassian said. I'm honoring it completely. You don't have to. The circumstances changed. She negotiated under duress. Your organization was compromised. The information she was working from was partial. Any reasonable... I'm not looking for a way out of it, Cassian said. She gave her word. It's the same as mine. Serrano picked up the document. Read it carefully, the way a man reads something when he has already decided his answer but is honoring the thing enough to know its details before he confirms it. Then he set it down and picked up the pen from beside his plate. He signed it. The blood feud, Cassian said. Serrano looked up. The 10 years of territorial conflict between our organizations, Cassian said. The Port Authority contacts, the judge you bought, the 2 operations you ran against my network in the Bronx in 2019. All of it. Serrano held his gaze steadily. I'm not asking for accountability, Cassian said. I'm asking for an end, a formal one. Both sides clean, going forward. He paused. Your people and mine spent last night running a joint operation that cleared 9 compromised positions and held together under pressure. That's more functional cooperation than we've managed in a decade of being enemies. You want a truce? I want an end to the feud. There's a difference. A truce implies both sides are still in a posture of conflict and have agreed to pause. An end means neither of us is in that posture anymore. Serrano sat back slightly in his chair. He was looking at Cassian with the expression of a man recalibrating something he'd held as settled for a long time. Your wife asked me 7 weeks ago to keep you alive, Serrano said. She offered me territory to do it. She didn't ask me to become your ally. She didn't ask for anything beyond the one specific thing. He paused. You're asking for something significantly larger. I'm offering something larger in exchange, Cassian held his gaze. The 2 crews in Red Hook that currently operate in contested space between our networks, undisputed to you. The warehouse district access we've been fighting over since 2020, undisputed to me. Clean borders, formally agreed, no ongoing negotiation required. He paused. And my word, which I understand you have no current reason to value, but which I'm offering anyway because it's the only currency I have that means anything. Serrano looked at him for a long moment. Your wife, he said. She's recovering. Yes. She told me in one of the messages that she'd been trying to get you to hear something for weeks before she contacted me. That she'd been leaving space in conversations and pointing at things and hoping you'd look at them. He paused. She said she couldn't say it directly because she was afraid of what it would cost her if she was wrong. Cassian was quiet. That's not a small thing for a person to carry, Serrano said. Knowing something important about the danger your partner is in, and not being able to say it directly because the relationship doesn't have the infrastructure for that kind of honesty. No, Cassian said. It's not. You're building that infrastructure now. Trying to. Serrano looked at the territorial agreement on the table between them. Then he looked at Cassian. The Red Hook crews and the warehouse district, he said. And your word. Yes. All right, Serrano said. They shook hands across a restaurant table in Midtown, over food neither of them had ordered, ending 10 years of conflict that had cost both their organizations significantly in ways that showed up in ledgers and ways that didn't. It wasn't a warm moment. It wasn't meant to be. It was 2 men who had spent a decade trying to dismantle each other, deciding that the energy had better uses, and doing so with the slightly uncomfortable practicality of people who understand that some decisions have to be made before you're entirely comfortable with them, or they don't get made at all. Before Serrano left, he stopped at the table's edge. Tell her I'm glad she's recovering, he said, and tell her the coat was not a significant sacrifice. I want to be clear about that. Cassian looked up at him. She asked me, Serrano said, with the slight expression of a man who found the question both understandable and somewhat beside the point. In the car, before the shooting started, she asked if she could borrow it and said she'd get it back to me. I told her to keep it. He paused. It was a coat. He left. Cassian sat alone in the dining room for a few minutes, drinking water, looking at the signed agreement on the table. His wife had asked to borrow the coat. Even in the middle of everything, In the car, cold and frightened and running out of options, she had asked permission. She had said she'd return it. He thought about what kind of person does that. What kind of person, in those circumstances, thinks to ask. He thought he knew. He thought he'd always known, actually, in the specific way you know things about people you've shared years with, not as information, not as data, but as an accumulated sense of who they are that lives somewhere below conscious analysis. He had known who Elena was. He had known it, and he had still made the choice he made at that elevator. And that was the version of the story he was going to have to live with for the rest of whatever came next. He picked up the agreement and folded it and put it in his inside pocket. Then he went back to his wife. The penthouse had been empty for 2 weeks while the security system was rebuilt. They went back on a Tuesday morning, the first one in December, with winter sunlight moving through the floor-to-ceiling windows and making the rooms look different from how they'd looked the last time either of them had been in them. The cameras were gone. The new system was Noah's, a completely different architecture, with Elena's biometrics built into the access layer alongside Cassian's, and a separate monitoring feed that ran to her own secured device, and not through any shared organizational infrastructure. The rooms felt larger without the old system in the walls. Cassian had spent 2 weeks at the medical facility, sleeping on a couch that was the approximate comfort level of poured concrete, because that was where Elena was, and leaving had not been a conversation he was interested in having with himself. He had run the organization from a laptop and 2 phones, and Noah's voice on a headset, which was approximately as efficient as running it from his office and significantly less comfortable. And he had not mentioned any of this to Elena because it was not a sacrifice and therefore did not need to be named as one. She knew, anyway. She always knew. On the first morning back in the penthouse, Elena stood at the windows for a long time, looking out at the city. December Manhattan, clear and cold, the kind of light that made the buildings look like they'd been cut from something harder than stone. Cassian was in the kitchen, doing something that could generously be described as making coffee, and was more accurately described as standing near the coffee machine in the approximate posture of a man making coffee while actually watching Elena at the window. She had been moving differently since the surgery, carefully, with the specific economy of motion that comes from having a part of your body temporarily removed from reliable service. The shoulder was improving. Harlan had said another 3 weeks before she'd have most of her range back. She had been doing the physical therapy exercises every morning with the quiet, slightly grim commitment she brought to things she had decided to do, regardless of whether she wanted to do them. She turned from the window. Cassian was looking at her. He was standing in the kitchen with a coffee cup in one hand and the look on his face that she had, over 4 years, come to understand as the look he wore when he had something he wanted to say and was deciding how to say it. A look that involved a specific quality of stillness and a slight tension around the eyes, the face of a man who had been trained to control what he communicated and was actively choosing not to, which for him was its own kind of vulnerability. She walked toward him, not all the way across the room, halfway, and then she stopped, and she looked at him, and she waited. He crossed the second half. He stopped in front of her, and he looked at her face the way he'd looked at it on the concrete under the bridge, and in the car on the way to the clinic, and in the chair beside her bed at the medical facility. The look of a man taking an inventory of something he had come close to losing and was in the ongoing process of understanding the value of. He reached out and tucked a piece of her hair behind her ear with the back of 2 fingers, careful, on the side away from the injured shoulder. A small gesture, the kind that cost nothing and meant more than most things that cost significantly more. "I listened to the voicemail," he said. She looked at him. "The last message you sent to Serrano. Noah kept a copy of the full communication log as evidence. I listened to it last night." He paused. You said, please, I know you don't have a reason to do this. I know what I'm asking is outside what any agreement covers, but please keep him safe. He stopped. You didn't finish the sentence." Elena was quiet. "What were you going to say?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The winter light moved slightly through the windows as a cloud passed. "He's the thing I'm most afraid of losing," she said. That was the rest of it. Cassian's jaw worked. He put his arms around her, careful of the shoulder, the way he'd learned to do it in the last 2 weeks. One arm across her back, hand flat between her shoulder blades, the other at her waist, nothing that put pressure on the left side. The careful embrace of a man who has been informed precisely where the damage is and is determined not to add to it. She leaned into him, her forehead against the side of his neck, her good hand at his back. They stood like that in the middle of their kitchen in December light, not saying anything, because what there was to say had been said across 2 weeks of slow, difficult, often uncomfortable conversations. And what was left was something that didn't have a verbal form yet, something that would develop one over time, in the ordinary accumulation of days where choices were made differently than they had been made before. He was not the same man who had pressed that elevator button. She was not the same woman who had walked into it. What they were now was less certain and more honest than what they'd been, which was uncomfortable in the specific way that honest things often are, and which was also, underneath that discomfort, something that might last. The organization changed over the following months in ways that were structural and therefore invisible from the outside, but significant from within. Elena's direct access to intelligence and financial information changed the decision-making process in ways that were sometimes slow and sometimes uncomfortable and consistently better. She caught 3 things in the first 6 weeks that would have caused significant problems if they'd gone unnoticed. Not because she was exceptional, but because a second set of careful eyes operating independently tends to see what a single set, no matter how experienced, has normalized into invisibility. She built her own small team. 2 analysts and a security specialist, all vetted through a process she designed herself, none of them reporting through the existing organizational hierarchy. It was a parallel track, deliberate, because the lesson of the last year was that parallel tracks existed anyway, and it was better to know about them. Gideon was handled through channels that kept his situation legal in form and permanent in outcome, a series of agreements and transfers and disclosures that removed him from any position of operational relevance and ensured that the network he'd built inside the Rourke organization had no remaining functional connection to him. He was alive. He was somewhere quiet. He would remain somewhere quiet. Marcus was a different problem. Marcus had cooperated fully. He had given names and access points and communication logs and had done it without the strategic partial compliance that Gideon had offered at the airstrip. He had given everything, and the everything had been complete and accurate as Noah's audit confirmed over the following weeks. The cooperation had been, in its way, the last expression of something real between them. The 23 years that had existed underneath the 8 years of betrayal, finally choosing to surface at the moment when it was the only thing Marcus had left to offer. Cassian did not see Marcus again after the Woodbridge facility. He sent word through Doyle, an arrangement, a location, a financial structure that would allow Marcus to live quietly and without want outside of New York, outside of any city where Cassian's network operated. Not generous, not punitive, simply possible. Marcus took it. Cassian understood that this was the thing he was going to carry longest. Not the betrayal, not even the specific damage of the 8 years, but the particular grief of losing a version of a relationship he had believed was one thing and had been something more complicated for longer than he'd known. That kind of grief didn't have a clean resolution. It had a slow metabolization, the way all significant losses do, and he was at the beginning of it. He told Elena about it one evening in January, standing at the windows in the same spot where she'd stood on the first morning back, watching the city. She listened. She didn't offer a clean summary of it or a reframe that made it more bearable. She said it made sense that it would take time, and she said she thought the grief was appropriate, and she said that grieving what something actually was, rather than what you needed it to be, was hard and important, and that she respected that he was doing it. Then she put her hand on the back of his hand where it rested on the window frame. He turned his hand over and held hers. Outside, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan always did, moving, accumulating, eating its losses, and reassembling around them, producing the next version of itself out of the materials of the previous one. A city that had been built on the premise that whatever came before was raw material for what came next. Cassian Rourke remained a feared man in a dangerous city. The organization he ran was real, and it operated in spaces that had nothing to do with legitimacy, and he had no illusions about what that meant or what it cost, or who paid those costs, and how. He was not a good man in any simple sense of the word, and he did not spend his time pretending otherwise. But he was something different from what he had been in that penthouse hallway the night he had pressed an elevator button and turned his back and convinced himself he was right. He was a man who listened now. Not perfectly. Not always on the first attempt. But he listened, And when he was wrong, he said so in specific terms, rather than in the general language of a person who wants credit for the acknowledgement without the weight of the detail. And he had stopped treating certainty as a form of strength. These were not large changes. They were not dramatic. They were the kind of changes that happen in small rooms and quiet moments, and the daily accumulation of choosing differently than you had chosen before, which is the only way any real change ever actually happens. Elena knew all of this. She watched it without commentary because she understood that naming it would make it a performance rather than a truth, and performance was the thing they had both decided they were done with. She had not forgotten what happened on the night of the storm. Cassian had stopped asking her to. What they built in the months after was not a better version of what they'd had before. It was a different thing, made of different materials, with different tolerances, and different load-bearing structures. Less decorative, more durable. The kind of thing that had been tested before it was finished, and therefore knew its own limits, in a way that untested things never do. On a morning in late February, Cassian found Elena in the kitchen before he was fully awake, standing at the counter in the gray light with 2 cups of coffee already made, reading something on her tablet. Her shoulder had recovered enough that she was moving without the careful compensation she'd been managing since December. She didn't hear him come in. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her in the gray morning light. His wife, reading at their kitchen counter, alive and intact and present in a way that he had come within a night's worth of bad decisions of losing permanently. And he felt something that he did not have a specific word for, but that lived in the body rather than the mind, somewhere behind the sternum where the things that actually matter tend to reside. She looked up, saw him in the doorway. "Coffee's ready," she said. "I see that." She went back to her tablet. He crossed the kitchen and picked up the second cup and stood beside her at the counter and looked at whatever she was reading over her shoulder. And she tilted the tablet slightly so he could see better without moving. Outside, February light was coming up over Manhattan. They stood there in it side by side in the day.